What if the differences we see between Europeans and Africans today were not the result of a single moment in history, but the outcome of tens of thousands of years of migration, climate, disease, sunlight, survival, and adaptation long before nations, borders, or modern ideas of race? Human beings were already being shaped by radically different worlds. From the burning sun of Africa to the cold, dim landscapes of Ice Age Europe, the human body kept changing in ways most people never fully realize. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. The story begins long before Europe exists as an idea, before Africa is divided by borders, before anyone has words for continent or colour or ancestry. It begins in a world of moving grass, retreating forests, drying lakes, sudden rain, and distances so large that human memory cannot hold them. Across eastern and southern Africa, bands of early Homo sapiens move through shifting landscapes that never stay still for long. Coastlines expand and contract. Rivers alter course. Green corridors open and close between dry country. Herds pass through in great numbers and then vanish again into dust and heat. In this restless setting, human beings do what they will continue to do for tens of thousands of years. They walk, watch, adapt, remember, and survive. What makes this beginning so important is that the ancestors of Europeans and the ancestors of Africans are not yet separate stories. They are still one deep human population history, layered and diverse already, but not divided into the later branches that people now imagine when they hear those continental names. The oldest roots of our species lie in Africa, and not as a neat point on a map, but as a broad, ancient, evolving human world. What survives in the record suggests that early Homo sapiens do not emerge in one moment and then simply spread outward unchanged. They develop across a mosaic of regions and populations, connected at times, isolated at others, shaped by climate pulses, local adaptation, and repeated movement. Even at the beginning, the human story is not simple. The landscapes of Africa in this distant age are far more varied than many people picture. There are humid forests, dry savannas, wooded valleys, seasonal wetlands, highlands cool enough to demand very different daily habits, and coastal zones rich in shellfish, fish, and small game. The continent is not a single environment producing a single type of person. It is a vast ecological engine of variation. That matters because evolution does not work on abstract labels. It works through people living in particular places, facing particular pressures, generation after generation. Long before anyone enters Ice Age Europe, human beings in Africa are already adapting to altitude, drought, disease burdens, food scarcity, heat, and changing rainfall. Africa is not merely the starting point in a migration tale. It is the first great laboratory of human difference. There is something almost misleading about how often the distant past is described as primitive. These people are not crude shadows waiting for history to begin. They're fully human in the most important sense. They form bonds, care for children, read landscapes with astonishing skill, and depend on shared knowledge to stay alive. Their tools improve. Their use of fire becomes part of daily life. Their foraging is strategic, not random. Along some coastlines, they collect marine foods that offer a dependable nutritional advantage. In certain places, they shape pigments, ornaments, and symbolic objects that hint at identity, memory, and communication reaching beyond the immediate needs of hunger. The evidence remains incomplete, but enough survives to show minds already capable of abstraction, planning, and social complexity. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. It is tempting from the modern world to imagine a straight line: first humans in Africa, then a group leaves, then Europe and Africa become separate biological destinies. But real prehistory is less like a line than a braided river. Populations split and reconnect. Some groups remain in one region for long stretches. Others move gradually across generations, not on a single heroic journey, but through countless small decisions made in response to water, prey, weather, and opportunity. A valley grows harsher, a shoreline becomes richer, a corridor opens into unfamiliar country. Children are born farther from their grandparents' homeland than anyone intended. Over thousands of years, a population can travel extraordinary distances without ever setting out to conquer them. Somewhere within this long African story, certain groups begin moving into the broader landscapes of Southwest Asia and beyond. This is not the first time a human relative has left Africa. Earlier human species have done so in much older migrations. But Homo sapiens carries something new into these worlds, a particular blend of flexibility, cooperation, and adaptive intelligence that proves unusually powerful. Even so, departure is not destiny. Leaving Africa does not instantly create Europeans. It only begins the slow process by which some human populations will eventually inhabit very different environments and, under those pressures, begin to change in some ways from relatives who remain in Africa. That separation, at first, is probably almost invisible. A few generations outside Africa do not transform anyone into a distinct type of human, nor do a few thousand years. Evolutionary difference builds slowly, often unevenly, and sometimes not at all, unless the pressure is strong enough and persistent enough. Early people moving northward or northeastward still carry the deep African inheritance of the species. Their anatomy, skin tone, physiology, and genetics reflect a recent origin in warmer, brighter environments. They're not yet adapted to weak northern sunlight, long winters, different pathogens, or the seasonal hunger that colder regions can impose. Those changes will come later, and not all at once. For now, what matters is the shared starting ground. The people who will one day become ancestral to many later Europeans, and the people who will remain within Africa still belong to one broad human continuum. They are close enough in ancestry that separating them too early distorts the truth. In fact, scholars still debate exactly how these early populations are structured, because ancient human history is proving more tangled the more closely it is studied. Genetic research has shown that African populations today preserve extraordinary depth and diversity, reflecting lineages that have been differentiating, reconnecting, and surviving across immense spans of time. Europe, by contrast, enters the picture later as one destination among several for outward-moving populations. In that sense, Africa is not one branch beside Europe. It is the much deeper trunk from which all later branches emerge. There is another reason this beginning matters. Modern discussions of human difference often start too late, at the point where visible contrasts already exist. That invites the illusion that such contrasts are fixed, obvious, and ancient in their present form. But rewind far enough, and those familiar markers lose their certainty. The pale skin associated with many Europeans today is not some original northern essence reaching back to the dawn of humanity. It evolves much later. Many of the traits now associated with different populations are recent in evolutionary terms, shaped by environments and lifeways that emerged long after the first dispersals. The deeper past is a reminder that human beings are dynamic, not static. Our bodies are records of adaptation, not categories carved at the beginning of time. The world these early humans inhabit is also one of repeated crisis. Climate in the Pleistocene is unstable in ways difficult to imagine from modern memory. Wet phases can green large regions that are later swallowed again by aridity. Habitats expand and fragment. Sea levels rise and fall dramatically as ice accumulates and melts in higher latitudes. These changes do not affect all regions equally. Some populations are pushed into refuges where isolation may increase. Others expand when conditions improve and encounter neighbours from whom they were once separated. This constant environmental reshuffling may be one reason why early human variation is already so rich inside Africa. Separation creates difference. Reconnection spreads innovations and genes. No single explanation fully accounts for this complexity, but the pattern fits a species repeatedly shaped by both fragmentation and contact. And so the first chapter of the story is not really about Europe or Africa as opposing worlds. It is about a shared human inheritance formed in Africa under conditions of extraordinary ecological diversity. The first great differences are not continental stereotypes but local adaptations, subtle variations accumulating in populations whose lives are tied to forests, coasts, uplands, dry plains, and shifting rain belts. Out of this immense African background, some groups move into Eurasia. Others do not. Some lineages disappear, others expand. Some leave faint traces in bones and stone tools. Others survive more clearly in living genomes. But all of them belong to the same human drama of motion and adjustment. If one could stand above this world and watch the story unfold in accelerated time, it would not look like nations or races assembling into place. It would look like scattered fires appearing and fading across an enormous continent. It would look like footprints along a wet shore that the tide erases by morning. It would look like small groups crossing grassland after a season of rain, then sheltering in rock overhangs when the wind turns colder than expected. It would look like memory being carried in bodies, in habits, in knowledge of where water lies hidden, in the choice of stone, in the timing of movement, in the ability to endure one more season and then another. Everything that comes later begins here. The later evolutionary story of Europeans cannot be understood without Africa because Europe is, in a biological sense, a late frontier of a much older African species, and the later evolutionary story of Africans cannot be reduced to a background role in someone else's migration because Africa remains its own centre of adaptation, diversity, and change throughout the entire human past. The separation that will one day matter is still ahead. For now there is only the long common beginning, one species under a difficult sky, spreading across an unstable land, not yet divided in the ways the modern eye expects, but already carrying within it the possibility of many futures. Africa does not stand still while a fraction of its people begin moving outward. That is one of the most important truths in the entire story, and one of the easiest to lose. Once the migration narrative begins, popular imagination tends to follow those travellers north and west, as if the main human drama has left the continent behind. But Africa remains the central stage of human variation, and in many ways it becomes even more complex as time passes. While some lineages move into Eurasia, countless others continue adapting within Africa's immense environmental range, shaped not by one climate or one challenge, but by a continent-sized set of pressures that rarely align in the same way for very long. To understand why Africa produces such extraordinary human diversity, it helps to picture the continent not as a single block, but as a series of ecological worlds joined together unevenly. In one region, people live in open savannas where long-distance movement, broad territorial knowledge and an intimate awareness of animal migrations matter for survival. In another, dense tropical forests reward different forms of mobility, perception, and diet. Along major river systems and wetlands, food security may rise or fall with water cycles that can shift over generations. Highland zones create cooler conditions, thinner air, and different disease ecologies. Arid belts push human groups toward flexibility, opportunism, and seasonal movement. Coasts open access to marine foods and tidal rhythms that inland populations never experience. These are not minor local details. Over enough time, environments like these create different selection pressures, different social responses, and different patterns of isolation and contact. What survives in the records suggests that this diversity reaches back very deep into the past. Africa contains lineages that have separated and reconnected over immense periods, leaving traces in living populations that geneticists are still trying to fully understand. Some groups appear to preserve unusually old branches of human variation. Others reflect later mixing between previously separated populations. The result is that Africa today contains more genetic diversity than any other continent, and this is not a recent accident. It reflects a long history of large population size in some regions, fragmentation in others, and repeated movement across ecological corridors that open and close with climate. Scholars still debate the details of how these ancient populations are structured, but the broad pattern is clear. Human diversity is deepest in Africa because human history is deepest there. That fact alone complicates the modern habit of speaking about Africans as if they have always formed one uniform biological group. They have not. The category is far too broad for the history it tries to contain. A person living in the Horn of Africa, a foraging community in Central African rainforest, a pastoral population in the eastern savannas, and a group in the far south may all belong to the same species and the same continent, but over time they face very different pressures, mix with neighbours in different ways, and preserve different lineages, language, subsistence, mobility, disease exposure, altitude, rainfall, and social networks all play their part. The deeper the research goes, the more the image of a single undifferentiated African population dissolves. Even the rhythms of climate encourage this complexity. During wetter phases, corridors may open across regions that are later cut off by desert or drought. The Sahara itself is one of the great examples, because it is not always the enormous barrier known today. At different times in prehistory, large parts of it are greener, dotted with lakes, grasslands, and animal populations capable of sustaining human settlement and movement. Then conditions shift again, and routes close. A population that spreads during one favourable phase may later become more isolated, adapting to new local conditions. When climates improve once more, people meet again, and the continent's human map is redrawn. This repeated opening and closing of ecological pathways may help explain why African history contains both deep divergence and repeated blending. Separation makes difference possible. Reconnection prevents those differences from hardening into neatly isolated blocks. There are also details in Africa's human story that still surprise many people because they cut against familiar assumptions. One is that some of the most striking examples of local adaptation within our species appear inside Africa itself, not just outside it. Populations living for long periods in high-altitude regions face oxygen challenges different from those in lowland zones. Groups in malaria-heavy environments come under intense selection pressure related to red blood cells and immune response. Communities dependent on pastoralism may evolve traits linked to adult milk digestion, but not all pastoral populations do so in the same way. In some dry or marginal landscapes, mobility patterns become central enough to shape social organization across generations. None of this produces separate human species. It produces regional variation inside one species, exactly the kind evolution generates when people remain connected enough to share ancestry, but exposed long enough to different pressures. Disease may be one of the most underestimated forces in this early African story. Warm climates, abundant parasites, insect-borne illnesses, and close relationships with particular ecologies create selection pressures that are often stronger and more immediate than cold or hunger. A disease environment can shape who survives childhood, how bodies manage infection, and which genetic variants persist. Malaria is the obvious later example, but it is not the only one. Pathogen load more broadly matters, and in tropical regions it can act as a constant background filter on human biology. This does not mean African populations evolve in one uniform direction. Disease ecologies differ between wetlands, forests, highlands, and drier zones. Even so, the sheer importance of infection in many African environments helps explain why immunity becomes such a major theme in human evolution there. The social side of variation matters too. Human beings do not adapt only through genes. They adapt through culture, movement patterns, food processing, marriage networks, tool traditions, and the transfer of ecological knowledge. In a continent as large and varied as Africa, these social systems can produce very different kinds of resilience. A group that knows how to survive drought through seasonal movement may weather a crisis that destroys a more settled population. Coastal knowledge may buffer some communities from inland collapse. Forest expertise may allow survival in places outsiders find nearly impossible to read. The evidence remains incomplete, but archaeology increasingly suggests that innovation appears in multiple African regions at different times, rather than radiating from a single civilizational core. Intelligence is distributed, adaptation is local, complexity is old. This is also the stage where one of the great misunderstandings of human evolution can be corrected. The common phrase that humans came out of Africa is true in one broad sense, but it can leave the false impression that once a departure happens, Africa becomes evolutionarily quiet. In reality, Africa continues generating diversity, preserving ancient lineages, and hosting populations whose histories are often more complex than those of later Eurasian groups, derived from smaller subsets of this older variation. Europe, in time, will become a place of its own layered adaptations and repeated migrations, but Africa remains the larger and deeper reservoir of human difference. A lesser-known clue to this depth lies in how difficult it has sometimes been for scientists to force African populations into older evolutionary models. For years, many simple family tree diagrams implied neat splits between groups, as though one population branches cleanly into another. But African prehistory often resists that image. Some lineages appear to have diverged long ago, then exchanged genes later. Others may reflect population structure so ancient and complicated that no single branching model captures it well. In other words, even before Europe becomes a major theatre of human adaptation, Africa has already written a more intricate evolutionary script than earlier scholarship could easily describe. This matters because the story of later European and African difference does not begin with two ready-made populations standing apart. It begins with one continent holding the richest store of human diversity on Earth, from which only some branches move away. Those who remain do not remain unchanged. They continue evolving in place, sometimes rapidly, sometimes subtly, often in ways tied to climate, pathogens, food systems, and geography. The people who eventually populate Europe are descended from a subset of this broader variation, shaped later by founder effects, different ecologies, and contact with archaic humans outside Africa. But the background from which they emerge is African, and it is already profoundly diverse. So when the question is how Europeans and Africans evolved differently over time, the answer cannot start with a comparison of two fixed continental types. It has to begin with a more unsettling truth. One side of the comparison, Africa, is not a single side at all. It is a vast field of human variation older than Europe's later population history, and more internally diverse than any simple label can carry. The beginning of divergence is therefore not a clean split between equals. It is a narrowing. Some lineages leave a broad and varied ancestral landscape and enter new environmental worlds. Others remain within the old centre and continue changing there. Under the wide African sky, the human story is already multiple. Fires burn in distant regions under different stars. Rain falls on one community while another waits through dust and heat. Children inherit bodies tuned not only by ancient ancestry, but by local conditions their ancestors have endured for thousands of years. Along certain coasts, the sea continues to offer food and rhythm. In interior grasslands, movement remains the rule. In forests, knowledge becomes a map hidden in memory and practice. In high country, survival carries its own demands. None of this is secondary to the rest of human history. It is the foundation from which the rest unfolds. And because Africa remains so central, every later contrast with Europe must be measured against this older truth. Europe will come to represent one set of adaptations forged under colder skies and lower light. Africa will continue to contain many different human experiments at once, each shaped by its own ecology, contacts, and constraints. The divergence to come is real, but it begins not from simplicity, it begins from abundance. Then the sky changes. The farther some human groups move beyond Africa, the more the old environmental logic begins to loosen its hold. Light weakens, winters lengthen, seasons become harder-edged. Plant life follows a more dramatic yearly rhythm, abundant for a while, then withdrawn. Game animals move across colder landscapes that can be rich in certain moments and punishing in others. The body that has emerged within the broad climatic range of Africa is still a remarkably flexible human body. But now flexibility is tested in new ways. The people entering Eurasia, and much later the western reaches of Europe, are not stepping into an empty stage. They're entering worlds that demand different habits of movement, different uses of shelter, different relationships with food, and eventually different kinds of biological adjustment. It is important not to picture this movement as a single great march of pioneers striding northward, with a clear destination in mind. What survives in the record suggests something slower, more fragmented, and more uncertain. Human groups expand and contract. Some lineages push into new territory and vanish. Others pause in favourable zones for thousands of years. Some disperse along coastlines. Others move through inland corridors opened by climate. The road into Eurasia is not straight, and the road into Europe is even less so. Glacial cycles repeatedly transform the landscapes ahead, making them alternately more accessible and more hostile. A population can enter one region in a relatively mild phase, only for later cold to alter the rules of survival completely. Southwest Asia becomes a crucial threshold in this long process. It is here that African-descended Homo sapiens begin living for extended periods in environments already inhabited by other kinds of humans. It is also here that they experience climates that, while not yet fully European in severity, are different enough to matter. rainfall patterns shift, seasonal contrast grows sharper, day length changes more dramatically across the year. The farther north populations move, the more sunlight itself becomes a biological issue. In equatorial and near-equatorial zones, solar radiation is abundant and relatively predictable across the seasons. In higher latitudes, it is weaker, more variable, and often scarce for long stretches. That difference will matter profoundly later. But even before visible traits begin to shift, northern movement changes the balance of daily life. Cold does not simply threaten through discomfort. It changes energy economics. A body losing heat too quickly pays for it in calories. A group entering winter unprepared pays for it in lives. Shelter becomes more consequential. Fire becomes more central. Clothing, hide processing, storage strategies, and seasonal planning grow in importance. In warmer regions, a failed hunt may still leave edible plant foods or smaller fallback resources accessible nearby. In colder ones, scarcity can come with a sharp edge. Energy must be found, preserved, and rationed more carefully. A successful kill matters more when alternatives are thin and when freezing conditions can sometimes preserve food that would spoil rapidly elsewhere. This alters not only survival strategies but also social rhythms, because coordination, food sharing, and foresight become more essential under prolonged seasonal stress. The landscapes themselves push human perception in new directions. Open steppe and cold grassland are not like tropical forest or mixed savanna. Visibility changes, animal behavior changes, mobility patterns change. In some regions, prey may be abundant but highly seasonal. In others, small errors in timing may bring disaster. A group that misjudges migration routes, snowfall, or the onset of winter can find itself trapped between hunger and exposure. The evidence remains incomplete, but archaeological patterns suggest that human occupation of colder regions often depends on periods of climatic opportunity, followed by withdrawal or replacement when conditions worsen. Europe, especially during the Ice Age, is not a stable homeland waiting patiently for permanent settlement. It is an unstable frontier. This is where the story becomes easy to oversimplify. Modern audiences often jump directly from African origin to a familiar image of Europeans, as though the journey north quickly produces the bodies now associated with the continent. But the first populations entering Eurasia and Europe are not yet European in the later sense. They are recent descendants of African populations carrying a relatively warm climate human inheritance into colder and dimmer environments. Many of the traits later common in Europe, including very light skin pigmentation, evolve much later than people assume, for a very long time. The human beings living in Eurasia are biologically in transition, adapting through behavior first and genes only gradually where strong enough pressures persist. Behavior often buys time for biology. That is one of humanity's great advantages. A species that can sow, store, plan, teach, and coordinate can survive in conditions to which its body is not yet fully tuned. Fire can replace some lost warmth. Animal skins can substitute for fur. Seasonal shelters can buffer exposure. Knowledge of migration routes can offset ecological uncertainty. Cooperative childcare can reduce the risk of cold season mortality. Culture does not eliminate natural selection, but it changes its pace and direction. In some cases, it reduces pressure. In others, it creates new pressure by allowing people to live long enough in extreme environments for biological adaptation to begin accumulating. Humans do not simply wait for evolution to rescue them. They engineer partial solutions, and those solutions change the selective landscape itself. Europe adds another layer of difficulty because it is not one environment either. The Mediterranean basin differs from inland plains. Atlantic zones differ from continental interiors. Mountain systems create local barriers and refuges. Ice sheets farther north reshape not only temperature but hydrology, vegetation, and animal distribution across enormous distances. During glacial peaks, much of northern Europe is either uninhabitable or marginal. Human populations crowd into more southerly refuges or move along the edges of shifting ecological zones. When the climate softens, people expand again, then the cold returns, and the map is redrawn. Scholars still debate the full demographic consequences of these pulses, but no single explanation fully accounts for the repeated pattern of occupation, contraction, and recolonization visible across Ice Age Europe. That instability matters because small populations in harsh environments are especially vulnerable to founder effects and demographic bottlenecks. When only a limited number of people occupy a frontier region, chance can amplify certain traits simply because the population is small. Later expansions may spread those traits more widely than their initial significance would suggest. This is one reason why the evolutionary story of Europe differs from Africa's in more than climate alone. Africa, with its deeper and often larger web of connected populations, preserves more diversity. Eurasian and especially European populations at different points may pass through narrower channels, losing some ancestral variation, while becoming more exposed to the filtering effects of both environment and chance. The encounter with winter darkness may be the most subtle of these northern pressures. Human beings depend on sunlight in ways not obvious to the eye. It regulates circadian rhythms, mood, seasonal behavior, and crucial physiological processes. The reduced ultraviolet light of higher latitudes changes the balance between skin pigmentation and vitamin D production. But that later development begins as a problem before it becomes a solution. The early populations moving north are not yet visibly adapted to low-light conditions. Their bodies and lifeways must cope first through diet, behavior, and perhaps partial use of nutrient-rich foods from animals and aquatic sources, only over longer spans, under persistent conditions. Do genetic shifts related to pigmentation and other traits begin to grow more common in some northern populations? There is also an emotional difficulty to imagining these worlds accurately. The cold past is often pictured as clean, empty, and almost theatrical, as though Ice Age people wandered through beautiful snowfields untouched by exhaustion or fear. The reality is almost certainly harsher. Wind strips heat from exposed skin. Wet cold kills more quietly than dramatic blizzard scenes suggest. Smoke fills enclosed shelters. Hands stiffen during tool work. Children and the elderly are especially vulnerable. Food security rises and falls with terrifying speed. Yet people do survive, and not barely. They learn these lands. They return to them. They shape tools suited to them. They follow animals across them. They bury their dead within them. What first appears alien becomes familiar through repeated occupation, and familiar ground becomes ancestral ground. A lesser-known detail in this long northern shift is that some of the most critical adaptations may have involved social timing as much as physical form. In strongly seasonal climates, knowing when to move can matter more than moving far. Knowing when rivers freeze, when herds cross, when stored food begins to fail, when daylight changes enough to alter hunting opportunities, all of this becomes survival knowledge. Human evolution here is not just a matter of skin or bone. It is also the evolution of planning depth, intergenerational memory, and social systems built to absorb seasonal shock. What survives in the record hints at technical and symbolic complexity, growing alongside environmental challenge, though the exact relationship remains debated. By the time human populations begin establishing themselves more firmly in Europe, the separation from Africa is still not absolute, but it is becoming consequential. Distance alone reduces gene flow. Geography imposes delays and barriers, different disease environments, different food bases, different light regimes, and repeated climatic bottlenecks begin pushing populations along separate adaptive paths. This does not mean that one path is more advanced than the other. It means that different problems reward different traits. Africa remains a continent of deep diversity, rich light, and many ecological experiments running at once. Europe becomes a colder proving ground where fewer populations, often smaller and more vulnerable, face intense seasonal pressures over long spans of time. Under those northern skies, the human body begins a long negotiation with cold, darkness, and scarcity. Not a dramatic transformation in a few generations, but a gradual conversation between environment and inheritance. The people living there remain unmistakably human, still bound by deep ancestry to those in Africa. Yet the terms of life around them are changing what survives, what spreads, and what becomes possible. The road ahead will not be shaped by climate alone. Other humans are already waiting in these lands, and the next turn in the story will come not just from weather, but from encounter. Once human groups are living for long stretches in very different environments, climate stops being a backdrop and becomes an active sculptor. It works slowly, invisibly, and without intent. But it leaves marks all the same. A colder world does not merely feel different from a warmer one. It rewards different bodies, different rhythms, different food strategies, and different margins of safety. A disease-rich tropical environment does the same in its own way. Over immense periods of time, this means that populations in Africa and populations in Europe are not simply separated by geography. They're being shaped by profoundly different combinations of sunlight, temperature, rainfall, pathogens, seasonality, and resource stability. That shaping is never total, never tidy, and never uniform, but it is real. Temperature is one of the clearest forces in the picture, though not always in the way people imagine. Cold climate does not create a single ideal human body any more than heat does. It creates pressures that favor certain traits under certain conditions. In broad terms, bodies that conserve heat more effectively can hold an advantage in colder regions, while bodies that shed heat efficiently can do better in hot ones. This principle shows up again and again across mammals, and human beings are not exempt from it. Over time, populations living in colder parts of Eurasia and Europe tend, on average, towards stockier proportions than those living in hotter environments, where longer limbs and leaner builds can help release body heat more effectively. These are broad tendencies, not rules that govern every person, but they reflect a familiar evolutionary logic. Surface area matters when survival depends on balancing heat loss and heat retention. Yet climate never acts alone. A body is not a thermostat floating in empty air. It is part of a whole way of life. Clothing, shelter, fire, diet, movement patterns, and social organization all change how strongly temperature presses on the body. A cold adapted build may matter, but so does the ability to store food, build insulated shelters, or survive winter through cooperation. In a very hot region, leaner proportions may aid heat dispersal, but so does travelling at the right hour, resting in shade, knowing water sources, and structuring movement around the most punishing parts of the day. Human adaptation is always a braid of biology and behaviour. This is one reason scholars still debate the exact weight of climate versus culture in shaping some traits. The evidence is strong that both matter. The harder question is how much each matters in each place and period. Rainfall patterns also shape human evolution more than they're usually given credit for. In many African regions, the decisive pressure is not simply heat but unpredictability. A landscape that swings between abundance and scarcity can reward flexibility above specialization. People who live through shifting wet and dry seasons must manage water, movement, and food risk differently from populations in temperate zones with stronger seasonal cold but more predictable annual cycles. In Africa, some groups face long histories of drought stress, fluctuating grazing conditions, unstable river systems, and the need to cover large distances. Others live in forest zones where dense vegetation, high humidity, and complex foraging ecologies create very different forms of knowledge and endurance. These settings do not produce one continental answer. They produce local solutions. Still, when looked at from a wide enough scale, patterns begin to emerge. In much of Africa, high ultraviolet radiation, heat stress, and disease exposure remain persistent forces. In Europe, lower ultraviolet light, stronger cold stress, and sharper seasonal fluctuations become central. This means that what counts as a favorable trait in one place may be neutral or even costly in another. Evolution does not move toward perfection in the abstract. It moves toward adequacy within a particular environment. A body well suited to long-term life under intense sun is not automatically well suited to weak light northern winters. A body efficient in conserving heat may be less ideal for dispersing it in tropical conditions. That is how populations diverge without ceasing to belong to one species. They are responding to different problems. Seasonality may be one of the most important of those problems. Europe, especially at higher latitudes, confronts human populations with extreme annual contrasts. Food can be plentiful for part of the year and suddenly difficult to secure later. Daylight itself changes dramatically across the seasons, affecting activity, perception, and even psychological experience. In many African environments, seasonality matters too, but the form it takes is often different. The contrast may center more on rain and drought than on cold and darkness. This shapes not only ecology but time itself. A temperate or subarctic year teaches one set of habits. A tropical wet-dry cycle teaches another. Over generations, bodies and cultures alike become tied to these rhythms. The disease environment deepens the contrast. In many parts of Africa, tropical and subtropical ecologies expose human populations to a heavy and varied pathogen burden. Parasites, mosquito-borne diseases, waterborne infections, and other threats mean that survival can depend as much on immune resilience as on food acquisition. In Europe, pathogens matter too, of course, but the baseline ecological regime is often different, especially before dense farming populations transform disease transmission later on. Cold does not erase disease, but it shifts the spectrum. This means that populations in Africa and Europe may experience very different selection pressures on immune-related genes, especially over long spans. Some of the most consequential evolutionary differences between populations may have less to do with what is visible on the outside than with how bodies recognize and respond to infection. There is a quiet irony here. Modern discussions of human difference are often drawn toward the obvious, especially skin color, because it is easy to see. But some of the most important divergences may have happened in invisible systems: immunity, metabolism, fat storage, developmental timing, or the regulation of nutrients under different diets and light conditions. The body is constantly negotiating with its environment in ways that do not announce themselves dramatically. A gene variant that helps survival against a local disease may matter more than a visible physical trait. A change in how calcium or vitamin D is processed under weak sunlight may affect reproductive success across generations more than any obvious alteration of body shape. What survives in the record suggests that much of human evolution is hidden inside ordinary physiology. Food availability adds another layer. Cold environments often reward calorie-dense diets and reliable access to animal fat and protein, particularly where plant foods are scarce or highly seasonal. Tropical and subtropical environments can support broader year-round foraging in some regions, but they also expose populations to scarcity in different forms, especially when rainfall fails. These differences matter because food is not only energy, it is raw material for growth, fertility, immune function, and brain development. A population consistently dependent on marine foods. Large herbivores, tubers, grains, or milk may face selection pressures very different from one relying on another combination. Before agriculture intensifies these contrasts, climate has already prepared the ground by structuring what kinds of food webs are even possible. There are also strange thresholds in this story. A pressure can exist for thousands of years without producing a dramatic genetic change if behavior compensates for it well enough. Then conditions shift. Compensation weakens, and selection intensifies. Low sunlight, for example, may matter less if a population consumes enough vitamin-rich foods from animals or sea resources. Change the diet, change the settlement pattern, or move farther north, and the same biological issue becomes more urgent. This is why no single explanation fully accounts for evolutionary difference. Pressures overlap, cancel, amplify, or arrive in sequence. Climate sets many of the terms, but culture keeps rewriting the contract. A lesser-known detail is that even within Europe, climatic adaptation may proceed unevenly because Europe itself changes so dramatically through the Ice Age and after it. A population living in a glacial refuge in the south does not face the same pressures as one pushing into more northern zones during a milder interval. Likewise in Africa, a population on a humid coast experiences a very different environment from one on an arid inland plateau or in malaria-heavy lowlands. Continental comparison is useful only if it does not erase local reality. The danger lies in speaking too broadly and forgetting that adaptation happens to people in places, not to abstractions on maps. And yet broad contrasts do matter. Over many thousands of years, African and European populations increasingly inhabit ecological worlds that differ enough to shape them along somewhat different lines. Europe becomes a setting where cold stress, low ultraviolet light, winter scarcity, and repeated population bottlenecks exert strong pressure. Africa remains a continent where human groups continue to face intense sun, varied disease ecologies, drought cycles, tropical complexity, and enormous regional diversity. The divergence is not absolute and never complete. Gene flow still occurs at times. Migrations continue. Cultural solutions reduce some pressures and create new ones. But the longer populations spend in these environments, the more their histories accumulate different selective traces. This is the point where evolution begins to feel less like a neat lesson and more like weathered evidence. There is no master plan, no ideal European body emerging from frost, no ideal African body emerging from sun. There are only populations living long enough under specific conditions for some traits to persist more often than others. Some of those traits are visible later, many are not. Some result from direct environmental pressure, others spread partly through chance in small populations. Some are amplified by later agriculture, migration, or social structure. Some remain contested in the scientific record, but climate is there throughout, patient and impersonal, shifting the odds. The people themselves would not have described this process in such terms. They would have known it through hunger, through the angle of light, through the season when children were most vulnerable, through the illnesses that returned with insects or standing water, through the way the cold entered the hands before dawn, through the distances that had to be walked between safe places. Evolution is made of these lived pressures repeated across generations. It is history written into survival. And so by the time the story moves toward more visible differences, the deeper work has already been underway for millennia. Africa and Europe are not merely 2 points on a map. They're 2 vast arenas of adaptation with overlapping ancestries but increasingly different environmental demands. One favors certain balances of heat, light, immunity, and mobility. The other favors different ones. Neither produces a pure type. Both produce human beings carrying the marks of negotiation with the worlds around them. The next of those marks will become one of the most visible in all human history, though even that story proves far more complicated than first appearances suggest. Nothing about skin is simple, even though it is often treated as the most obvious difference of all. It is visible, immediate, and easy to sort by the eye, which is precisely why it has invited so much misunderstanding. But skin pigmentation is not a symbolic label placed on humanity at the beginning. It is an adaptation, one of the most elegant and misunderstood in the human body, shaped over long spans by the problem of sunlight. To understand how Europeans and Africans evolved differently over time, this is one of the clearest places to look, though even here the truth is more layered than the familiar story suggests. In much of Africa, especially in regions with strong year-round ultraviolet radiation, darker skin offers a profound biological advantage. High levels of melanin help protect the body from the damaging effects of intense sunlight, particularly ultraviolet radiation that can injure skin cells and affect important nutrients such as folate. Folate matters because it plays a role in cell division, growth, and healthy fetal development. When sunlight is intense enough over many generations, natural selection favors pigmentation that reduces this damage while still allowing the body to function normally in a bright environment. This is not about beauty, symbolism, or identity in the modern sense. It is about survival and reproductive success under a specific solar regime. That regime is not identical across Africa, which matters more than broad continental language usually allows. A population living near the equator in open landscapes experiences sunlight differently from one in a highland zone, a dense forest, or the northern and southern margins of the continent. Even so, across large parts of Africa, the long-term pressure of strong ultraviolet radiation remains significant enough that darker pigmentation becomes one of the most stable and effective human adaptations. This is why many researchers believe that darker skin was likely the ancestral condition for early Homo sapiens. A species emerging in Africa under strong sun would have needed it. The deeper irony is that Europeans' much lighter skin is not the original human default, it is a later adaptation. That point is easy to say and still not fully absorb, because modern assumptions run so deep. In popular imagination, pale skin can feel ancient in a timeless way, as though northern populations always looked much as they do today. But the evidence suggests otherwise. The earliest modern humans entering Eurasia almost certainly do not look like later northern Europeans. They carry with them relatively darker pigmentation, inherited from recent African ancestry. Only over long periods, in regions with weaker ultraviolet light, do lighter skin variants become more advantageous and eventually more widespread in some populations. The reason is a biological trade-off. Human beings need protection from excess ultraviolet radiation, but they also need enough ultraviolet exposure to produce vitamin D in the skin. Vitamin D is essential for bone health, immune function, and reproductive success. In strong sun environments, getting enough vitamin D is not usually the main problem. In weak sun environments, especially at high latitudes with long winters and limited ultraviolet intensity, it can become a serious constraint. A heavily pigmented skin that works beautifully under equatorial sun may reduce vitamin D production too much under persistently dim northern conditions. Over thousands of years, this shifts the balance in Europe, particularly after human groups settle for long spans in low-light regions. Selection begins favoring lighter pigmentation that allows more efficient vitamin D synthesis. But even that familiar explanation needs care. Skin lightening does not happen instantly, and it does not happen in the same way everywhere. Scholars still debate the exact timing and relative importance of different genetic pathways, because the evidence from ancient DNA has complicated earlier assumptions. Some prehistoric populations in Europe appear to retain darker skin longer than once expected, even after occupying the continent for substantial periods. Meanwhile, other traits such as eye color or hair color may shift on different timelines. This means the visual package now associated with European appearance is not a single ancient inheritance arriving all at once. It is a layered construction assembled gradually through different episodes of selection, migration, and mixing. A particularly surprising detail is that agriculture may have intensified the pressure for lighter skin in parts of Europe, rather than being the original cause of it. Hunter-gatherers with diets rich in fish or animal foods may have obtained more vitamin D from what they ate, partly reducing the need for lighter skin. Later farming populations, especially those relying more heavily on grains and consuming fewer vitamin-rich wild foods, may have faced greater risk of deficiency under low-light conditions. In that setting, lighter pigmentation could become even more advantageous. No single explanation fully accounts for the whole process, but this helps explain why some of the genes linked to lighter skin rise to high frequency relatively late in European prehistory, not immediately when humans first enter the north. Africa, meanwhile, does not simply preserve one unchanging dark skin type across all regions. Pigmentation variation exists there too, and it reflects the same basic principle: sunlight, ancestry, and local history interacting over time. East Africa, Southern Africa, forest populations, pastoral groups, and populations with later admixture histories can all show different pigmentation patterns. The continent's diversity is written into the skin as well as the genome. Even so, because much of Africa lies under stronger ultraviolet conditions than Europe, the long-term evolutionary advantage of darker pigmentation remains strong across large areas. The result is that while Europe sees strong selection in favor of lighter skin under weak sunlight, many African populations continue under very different solar terms. There is also a human subtlety here that often gets lost when skin is discussed only as biology. Skin color is visible to others, but natural selection does not care about the categories later societies build around visibility. It responds to whether a trait improves survival and fertility in a given setting. That distinction is important because modern racial systems turned skin into an enormous social marker, then projected that system backward into prehistory as though nature itself intended those meanings. It did not. Dark and light pigmentation are functional outcomes shaped by environmental pressures, later tangled in politics, hierarchy, and myth. The biology is real. The social stories built on top of it are something else. Another lesser-known point is that dark skin and light skin are not simple opposites produced by one genetic switch. Pigmentation is influenced by many genes, and similar outward results can arise through different evolutionary routes in different populations. That means light skin in one region is not necessarily built from exactly the same genetic history as light skin in another. It also means that populations can carry complicated combinations of ancestry and pigmentation traits that do not fit older simplistic models. What survives in the record suggests repeated adaptation, not one neat global ranking of shades. The visual drama of pigmentation also obscures how recent some of these changes are. In evolutionary time, much of the variation people obsess over today is young. The separation between African and European pigmentation patterns feels ancient to modern observers because it is socially amplified. But compared with the full span of human existence, it belongs to the later chapters. For most of the history of Homo sapiens, everyone alive is far closer in appearance to an African ancestral condition than to the diversity of pigmentation seen today across northern Eurasia. That alone should unsettle any idea that modern continental appearances are primordial. There is an even deeper lesson in this. Skin records geography, but only loosely. It tells part of the story of ultraviolet light, movement, and adaptation, but it does not capture the full complexity of ancestry. A population may become lighter or darker under environmental pressure, while still carrying deep shared ancestry with others far away. Migration can introduce new combinations. Mixing can blur older signals. Social boundaries can preserve patterns temporarily, then collapse. Looking at the skin, one sees one chapter of human evolution, not the whole book. By the time the story settles into the broad pattern familiar today, the contrast is striking enough to seem inevitable. Many African populations retain darker pigmentation, well suited to intense sunlight. Many European populations develop lighter pigmentation, better suited to low-light conditions. Yet inevitability is misleading. These outcomes depend on latitude, diet, time depth, migration, and chance. Change the climate, alter the food system, interrupt movement, or shift the demography, and the trajectory changes too. Evolution is not painting continents according to a fixed scheme. It is making local adjustments that later appear from a great distance, like continental identity. The people living through these changes would not have recognized the future meanings attached to their bodies. A child born with slightly different pigmentation is not thinking about continents or categories. The difference matters only insofar as it affects health, fertility, and survival over countless generations. Somewhere in the long northern past, lighter variants become a little more likely to persist. Somewhere in the bright African landscapes, darker protection continues to hold its advantage. Slowly, the visible map of humanity begins to shift, and yet the visible map remains deceptive. Two populations may differ strongly in pigmentation while still sharing most of their humanity in common. The trait is important because it is adaptive and because it became socially magnified, but it is only one outcome of a much broader evolutionary process. Beneath the skin, other differences are accumulating too, some more subtle, some more consequential, many invisible. The body is still negotiating with heat, disease, food, and terrain. Skin may be the feature people notice first, but the next layer of divergence is written into the shape of the body itself, into how humans hold warmth, move through space, and endure the environments they inherit. Skin changes with light, but the rest of the body is also keeping score. Over long spans of time, human populations living in different climates begin carrying different physical balances, not because nature is trying to sort people into rigid types, but because temperature, terrain, food stress, and mobility keep favouring some arrangements over others, Europe's colder regions and Africa's hotter, more varied climatic zones do not ask the same things of the human frame. As a result, the body becomes another quiet record of divergence, not in absolute categories, but in recurring tendencies that appear when enough generations spend enough time facing the same demands. One of the oldest ideas in biological anthropology is that body shape is partly influenced by climate. In broad terms, populations long adapted to colder environments tend to show, on average, relatively shorter limbs and more compact bodies, while populations long adapted to hotter environments tend more often toward longer limbs and leaner builds. The logic is straightforward. A compact body generally reduces surface area relative to mass, helping conserve heat. A leaner body with longer limbs increases surface area, making it easier to release heat. These are not iron rules, and human beings are too culturally flexible for climate to determine anatomy on its own. But when seen across deep time and large populations, the pattern is persuasive enough that it appears repeatedly in the fossil and skeletal record. Africa offers some of the clearest examples of bodies shaped for heat dispersal and endurance movement, especially in open and hot environments where shedding heat matters for survival. Longer, lower limbs, in particular, can improve the body's ability to manage high temperatures while moving across long distances. That matters in landscapes where water may be scattered, prey may travel far, and daily life itself can involve substantial mobility. A body that can walk or run efficiently in heat, while cooling effectively, carries a practical advantage. This does not mean all African populations look alike. Forest environments, highlands, river valleys, deserts, and pastoral zones all influence body form in different ways. Still, across many hot region populations, the basic thermal logic remains visible. Europe, especially under the repeated stress of glacial and near-glacial conditions, pushes in another direction. In colder climates, conserving heat becomes more valuable. Stockier proportions, somewhat shorter distal limbs, and broader trunks can help the body hold warmth more efficiently. This is not unique to humans. Similar principles appear in many animals living across cold and warm latitudes. What is distinctive in human beings is that biological adaptation works alongside cultural buffering. Fire, clothing, shelter, and food storage reduce the need for the body alone to solve the problem. Even so, when cold is severe, prolonged, and recurring, cultural solutions do not erase selective pressure. They merely shape how it operates. There is a danger, however, in making body form sound too mechanical. Human anatomy is never just climate translated into bone. Diet affects growth. Childhood illness affects growth. Activity level affects muscle attachment and skeletal stress. Population history matters. Chance matters. Small groups can amplify certain proportions simply through demographic history rather than direct adaptive advantage. And some traits that look climatically useful may partly reflect ancestry carried in from earlier populations. Scholars still debate where the line falls between adaptation, developmental plasticity, and inherited population structure. The evidence remains incomplete in many regions, especially where ancient skeletal samples are limited or unevenly preserved. What can be said with more confidence is that the body is not passively neutral across different worlds. If a population spends thousands of years in hot, open country, repeatedly exposed to heat stress and long-distance movement, the human frame responds one way. If another population spends long stretches in cold, seasonal regions where heat loss is dangerous and food stress comes in annual waves, the response is likely to differ. These differences do not create separate human kinds. They create shifting averages inside one species. That distinction matters because modern ideology often takes population-level tendencies and treats them like destinies written into individuals. Evolution does not work like that. It changes probabilities, not identities. Movement itself may be one of the most overlooked parts of this story. The human body evolves not only in relation to climate, but in relation to how it must travel through the world. In parts of Africa, especially in earlier foraging lifeways, efficient long-range mobility may have remained central for immense spans of time. People follow seasonal resources, track game, relocate between water sources, and navigate ecologies that reward spatial knowledge over confinement. In Europe, mobility matters too, but winter, terrain, and later denser settlement patterns can alter its form. A population that must endure seasonal scarcity may depend more on storage, shelter stability, and coordinated return to known resource zones rather than purely wide-ranging movement. These are broad contrasts, but they can shape which bodily strategies prove most sustainable. Endurance deserves particular attention because Homo sapiens is, from the beginning, a remarkably capable long-distance mover. Our species is not built for raw speed compared with many animals, but it is unusually good at sustained movement, especially when combined with sweating, upright posture, and flexible pacing. In hotter environments, that combination can be extremely valuable. Persistent tracking, long foraging circuits, and repeated movement under heat all reward a body that manages temperature efficiently while staying in motion. What survives in the record suggests that this fundamental endurance capacity belongs to humanity as a whole. But some regional environments may favor preserving or emphasizing certain associated body proportions more than others. Then there is metabolism, a far less visible but equally important frontier of adaptation. Cold climates place different energetic demands on the body. Maintaining core temperature costs calories. So does growing through childhood under seasonal nutritional stress. A population dependent on animal fat and protein in harsh conditions may face different metabolic pressures from one living in hot climates with other dietary patterns. The exact evolutionary consequences are still debated, but researchers have long suspected that thermoregulation, fat storage, and energy use can vary in subtle population-level ways when shaped by different ecological histories. No single explanation fully accounts for these patterns, because metabolism is influenced by genes, developmental conditions, diet, disease, and culture all at once. Even so, the principle is hard to escape. Environments that challenge energy balance repeatedly are likely to leave some trace in how bodies process fuel. High-altitude Africa introduces another complication to any overly simple Europe versus Africa picture. Not all major bodily adaptations outside Europe arise from cold. Populations living for long periods in elevated African regions face oxygen stress that can shape physiology in striking ways. These adaptations are not identical to those seen in other high-altitude populations elsewhere in the world, which is itself revealing. Similar environmental problems do not always produce identical biological solutions. Evolution can take different routes to broadly similar outcomes. This matters because it reminds us that African evolution is not merely about heat and sunlight. It includes mountain adaptations, disease adaptations, and countless local pressures layered across different geographies. A lesser-known clue from skeletal evidence is that body form can also reflect changing labor, subsistence, and social patterns over time. As populations shift from foraging to farming, from high mobility to more settled life, or from one dietary base to another, skeletons often change accordingly. Bones record strain, repetition, and sometimes nutritional stress. This means later Europeans are not shaped by climate alone, but also by the agricultural transition, changing childhood nutrition, new workloads, and altered disease ecologies. The same is true in Africa, where pastoralism, farming, foraging, and mixed systems all leave different signatures on the body. The deeper story is one of bodies constantly renegotiating not just with climate, but with human-created ways of living. That is why the idea of bodies built for different worlds must be handled with care. It is true, but only if the phrase remains flexible enough to include many worlds within each continent, and many kinds of adaptation working at once. Europe is not just snow and cold. Africa is not just heat and sun. Each contains multiple ecological theatres. Yet in the broadest sense, their average pressures do diverge over time. Europe increasingly rewards traits that help survive colder, darker, more seasonal conditions. Many African environments continue rewarding heat management, pathogen resilience, mobility, or local ecological specialization. The body records these histories unevenly, sometimes clearly, sometimes only faintly. It is also worth noticing how much of this divergence remains invisible in everyday life, until it is placed under scientific scrutiny. Someone looking at two people from different populations may notice skin color first and stop there. But anthropologists examining limb proportions, trunk shape, growth patterns, bone density, muscle attachments, and metabolic implications see a deeper archive. The human form is not merely decorative, it is historical. It carries the weight of thousands of ordinary struggles repeated so often that they become anatomy. And still, even this anatomy does not tell the whole truth. Because Europe's human story is about to take a turn Africa does not share in the same way. Outside Africa, Homo sapiens is not alone. The people moving into Eurasia encounter older human lineages already adapted to some of these lands. Those encounters are not just cultural or competitive, they become biological. In Europe especially, the story of human evolution will soon involve inheritance from another kind of human entirely, a surviving trace of an ancient meeting that still lingers inside many people today. Long before Europe becomes associated with its later civilizations, it belongs to other humans, in caves, valleys, wooded river corridors, and cold uplands. Neanderthals have already lived for hundreds of thousands of years, surviving climatic swings that would have broken many species outright. They know these landscapes in a way newcomers do not. Their bodies are powerfully built, shaped by long residence in Ice Age Eurasia. Their hunting is close range and dangerous. Their lives are hard, intimate, local, and deep. So when Homo sapiens moves farther into Eurasia and eventually into Europe, the encounter is not with empty land. It is with an older human presence, one that has already adapted to the cold in its own way. For a long time, this meeting was told as a simple replacement story. Modern humans arrive, Neanderthals disappear, and that is the end of it. But the evidence no longer supports such a clean break. What survives in the genetic record suggests that the ancestors of most present-day people outside Africa carry a small but real inheritance from Neanderthals, usually around 1 to 2%, though the exact patterns vary. That means the encounter is not only competitive, it is also reproductive. At some point, in some places, these populations meet closely enough for children to be born, survive, and leave descendants. The old boundary between them is therefore not absolute. It exists, but it is porous. This matters enormously for the evolutionary story of Europeans, because it introduces something African populations largely do not share in the same way: systematic inheritance from a long-established Eurasian human lineage. Most sub-Saharan African populations today carry little or no direct Neanderthal ancestry compared with non-African populations, though later back migration into Africa complicates the picture in some regions. The broad contrast remains. Once Homo sapiens leaves Africa and mixes with Neanderthals outside it, a new ingredient enters the ancestry of many Eurasian populations, including those who will later contribute to Europe. That ingredient is small in percentage, but not necessarily small in consequence. The first thing to say is that Neanderthal ancestry does not turn later Europeans into something other than human. The contribution is modest, and all living people remain overwhelmingly Homo sapiens. But small amounts of inherited DNA can still matter if they affect useful traits. Scholars still debate exactly which Neanderthal-derived variants proved adaptive and which were neutral or harmful, because the picture is complicated. Many archaic gene variants appear to have been weeded out over time, suggesting they were disadvantageous in modern human bodies. Others seem to have persisted because they offered some benefit in local environments, especially in areas such as immunity, skin biology, and perhaps aspects of metabolism. This is one of the strangest turns in the whole story. As modern humans move into new northern environments, they do not rely only on their own mutations arising from scratch. In some cases, they may borrow useful variations from populations that have already spent immense spans adapting to Eurasian conditions. This process, known as adaptive introgression, remains an area of active research, but the principle is powerful. If Neanderthals carry variants that help with local pathogens, cold-related physiology, or skin and hair regulation in non-African conditions, then interbreeding offers a shortcut of sorts, not a complete solution, and certainly not a magical transfer of northern mastery, but a real evolutionary exchange. The immune system may be one of the clearest places where this exchange matters. A population entering new environments also enters new disease landscapes. Parasites, viruses, bacteria, and seasonal exposure patterns differ from those in Africa. If Neanderthals have been dealing with Eurasian pathogens for hundreds of thousands of years, then some of their immune-related genetic variants may already be tuned to these threats. Modern humans inheriting such variants could gain an advantage. Several studies have suggested that some archaic gene contributions do affect immune responses in later non-African populations. The exact functional significance remains debated in many cases, but the pattern is difficult to ignore. Europe's human future is being shaped not only by climate and isolation, but by biological inheritance from people who were there first. There is also an emotional charge to Neanderthals that can distort the evidence. Popular culture swings between portraying them as brutish near animals and portraying them as simply another flavor of modern human. Neither view is quite right. They are close relatives, intelligent and capable, but distinct. They make tools, use fire, hunt large game, care for injured individuals, and leave signs of symbolic behavior, though the extent of that symbolism is still discussed. Their disappearance is not proof of inferiority in some crude sense. Small population size, climatic instability, competition, absorption into larger Homo sapiens populations, and sheer bad luck may all play roles. No single explanation fully accounts for their vanishing. But before they vanish, they leave a trace inside the newcomers. That trace is not evenly distributed. The populations ancestral to later Europeans are only one part of a much larger Eurasian story. Neanderthal ancestry appears across many non-African groups, not just Europeans. In some Asian populations, proportions can differ slightly. and the exact segments preserved are not identical. Europe is therefore not uniquely Neanderthal marked, but it is deeply implicated in the long zone of interaction, where this mixing becomes part of the Homo sapiens story. For African populations that remain largely within Africa during these key periods, the evolutionary pathway is different. Their histories continue to be shaped overwhelmingly by African population dynamics, local adaptation, and later internal migrations rather than by sustained Neanderthal introgression. Yet Africa's own story is not simple absence. One of the more intriguing developments in recent research is the possibility that African populations also preserve traces of admixture with deeply divergent archaic or structured human populations within Africa itself, though the evidence is harder to interpret than the Neanderthal case. Ancient DNA preservation in Africa is often poorer, which limits certainty. Some scholars argue that patterns in modern African genomes may reflect admixture with archaic populations or very ancient population structure within Africa, rather than with one clearly defined other human equivalent to Neanderthals. The evidence remains incomplete, but the implication is important. Africa's evolutionary history may also include complex interactions among semi-isolated human groups, even if the exact cast of those interactions is less clearly known. That difference in evidence can create a misleading contrast. Europe appears to have a dramatic archaic chapter, because Neanderthals are visible in both fossils and DNA. Africa, with its deeper but less well-preserved record, may have had equally complex population structure that is simply harder to reconstruct. Even so, the Neanderthal encounter remains one of the clearest ways the ancestry of many Europeans diverges from that of many Africans. Outside Africa, Homo sapiens is entering a region already occupied by another human lineage and carrying part of that lineage forward. A lesser-known consequence of this admixture is that not all archaic inheritance is beneficial. Some Neanderthal-derived variants appear associated in modern populations with increased risks for certain inflammatory responses, autoimmune conditions, or other health effects under present-day conditions. A variant useful in one ancient disease environment can become costly in another. Evolution does not produce universally good genes. It produces trade-offs tied to specific contexts. A borrowed adaptation that once helped survival in Ice Age Eurasia might prove less helpful, or even harmful, in modern industrial life. This is another reminder that natural selection is about local usefulness, not perfection. The encounter also sharpens a broader truth about European evolution. It is not simply a story of Africans leaving Africa and then passively changing under new weather. It is a story of entry into occupied landscapes, exchange with resident humans, and adaptation through both innovation and inheritance. Europe's future populations will be shaped by climate, yes, but also by this inherited archaic residue, by repeated bottlenecks, and later by waves of migration that transform the continent again and again. The European branch is never biologically isolated in a pure sense. It is assembled from contacts, contractions, and recombinations. Seen from the African side, this chapter reinforces how different the two continental histories remain. Africa continues to hold the richest and oldest variation within Homo sapiens itself. Europe and the wider non-African world add a narrower but distinctive layer archaic inheritance from outside Africa. One is not better, older, or more advanced than the other. They are simply different historical pathways. African populations largely continue the long internal diversification of our species within its homeland. Many Eurasian populations, including those ancestral to Europeans, become partly composite, modern human in overwhelming proportion but carrying traces of earlier Eurasian humanity within them. In practical terms, the people living through this would never have understood it as ancestry percentages or introgressed variants. They would have known it, if at all, only through encounter another kind of human across the landscape, sometimes rival, sometimes stranger, sometimes close enough for a more intimate exchange. Somewhere in that contact zone, children were born whose existence blurred a boundary that had once seemed much harder. Most of the bones are gone now. Most of the meetings are forgotten beyond recovery, but the inheritance remains. And that inheritance becomes part of the reason Europe's evolutionary story cannot be reduced to climate alone. The body entering the north is not only adapting to cold and weak light, it is also, in small ways, carrying forward traits from those who had already endured those worlds for ages. Africa's story remains full of its own deep population complexity, but Europe's path now includes an ancient encounter written into the genome. The next great force to shape both continents will be less ancient and more relentless disease, settlement, and immunity. The invisible contest that often changes human evolution more profoundly than any visible feature ever could. If climate shapes the outside of the human story, disease shapes the inside. It works in blood, tissue, fever, infancy, pregnancy, recovery, and death. It kills quietly, often before history has words for what is happening. It filters populations generation after generation, sparing some, taking others, and rewarding small biological advantages that may be invisible to the eye, but decisive in survival. When thinking about how Europeans and Africans evolved differently over time, this hidden contest matters as much as sunlight or cold. In some regions, it may matter more. Africa's disease environments have long been among the most powerful selective landscapes in human history, though not in one simple continental way. Tropical and subtropical climates often support rich ecologies of parasites, insects, and waterborne pathogens. Warm temperatures, seasonal standing water, dense vegetation in some regions, and close interaction with animals can create conditions in which infection is a constant pressure rather than an occasional disaster. This does not mean every part of Africa is equally disease-heavy, because highlands, deserts, forests, coasts, and dry interior regions all differ. But across large parts of the continent, pathogen burden has been intense enough and persistent enough to shape human biology very deeply. Malaria is the most famous example, and for good reason. Few diseases have left such a visible mark on the human genome, in regions where malaria is common and deadly, especially to children. Even a partial protective effect can carry enormous evolutionary value. This helps explain why certain red blood cell variants, including the sickle cell trait, rise in frequency in some African populations despite their serious costs when inherited in double form. It is one of evolution's starkest trade-offs. A variant that can be devastating in one genetic combination persists because, in another, it helps protect against an even more lethal threat. The logic is brutal and local. Survival does not require a trait to be good. It requires only that it improve the odds enough under the conditions that exist. And malaria is only one piece of a larger pattern. Other infections, parasites, and immune challenges have likely shaped African populations in ways science is still trying to untangle. The immune system is immensely complex, and many of the genes involved interact with one another and with local ecologies in ways that are difficult to reconstruct from deep time. Even so, what survives in the record suggests that African populations have often been under strong selection related to pathogen exposure. This helps explain why some of the most important population-level evolutionary differences between Africans and Europeans may concern immune function rather than visible appearance. A body's ability to recognize infection, regulate inflammation, and survive repeated exposure can matter more across generations than any outward trait. Europe presents a different disease story, especially in earlier prehistory. In colder and more seasonal environments, the background disease ecology is often unlike that of tropical regions. Some parasites are less widespread, some insect-borne illnesses are less intense or less stable across the year. But this does not mean Europe is biologically easier. It means the pressures differ. A lower tropical pathogen burden in some places may reduce one type of selection, while increasing the relative importance of others. Respiratory infections, nutritional stress linked to winter scarcity, and later the diseases of denser settlements all become important in different ways. Europe is not healthier in some simple evolutionary sense. It is just dangerous according to a different script. This contrast matters because immune systems adapt to local disease worlds. A population long exposed to one set of pathogens may evolve differently from one long exposed to another. That divergence can leave lasting marks. Some gene variants that improve resistance in one environment may have little benefit elsewhere. Others may create trade-offs, protecting against one disease while increasing vulnerability to inflammatory disorders or autoimmune problems in another context. Scholars still debate the exact significance of many immune-related variants, because the system is so responsive and because ancient disease ecologies are often hard to reconstruct with certainty. But no single explanation fully accounts for the repeated pattern where diseases are constant. They become major evolutionary forces. The story becomes even more complicated once human settlement patterns begin changing. Small mobile foraging populations experience disease differently from denser, more settled communities. Mobility can sometimes reduce transmission by limiting prolonged crowding and allowing groups to move away from contaminated areas or depleted environments. Sedentary life, animal domestication, food storage, and growing population density alter the disease landscape profoundly. Pathogens that struggle to persist in sparse, mobile populations can become much more successful in dense ones. Close contact with domesticated animals introduces new possibilities for zoonotic disease. Waste accumulates, water becomes contaminated. Children grow up in more continuous exposure to infections. Immunity, in this sense, is not only shaped by nature but by human-created ecological change. This matters for both Africa and Europe. Though not always at the same time or in the same way, different regions on both continents adopt herding, farming, or mixed economies under different conditions. Some African populations become pastoralists in disease environments very different from those faced by early European farmers. Some European groups settle into villages and agricultural systems under lower sunlight and more seasonal cold, which creates its own nutritional and disease pressures. What survives in the record suggests that immune evolution accelerates or shifts whenever human communities begin clustering more densely, interacting more closely with livestock, or depending on narrower diets. The body is now responding not only to landscape, but to human society itself. There is another layer to this story that is easy to miss. Infection does not only kill directly, it also influences growth, fertility, pregnancy outcomes, and the survival of infants. A child repeatedly weakened by parasites or chronic infection may not die immediately, but may grow differently, resist other illnesses poorly, or fail to reach reproductive age. A pregnant woman under heavy disease burden faces different risks from one in a less pathogen-rich environment. This means that disease becomes woven into life history itself, It affects who survives childhood, who can bear children safely, and how much physiological energy is diverted from growth to immune defense. Over generations, those small differences accumulate. A lesser-known but revealing point is that some African adaptations associated with disease are not confined to one ancestry or language group, but appear wherever similar pressures exist. This suggests repeated local evolution rather than a single population carrying one fixed continental solution. The same is true in Europe, where different populations may acquire different immune-related variants through local selection, migration, or archaic introgression from Neanderthals. Similar broad problems can produce different genetic answers. That is one reason why sweeping claims about the African immune system or the European immune system are so misleading. Continents contain multiple evolutionary experiments, not singular biological templates. Still, the broad contrast remains meaningful. Many African populations have endured stronger long-term selection from tropical and subtropical infectious disease environments, while many European populations have been shaped more by temperate disease ecologies, seasonal stress, and later the epidemiological consequences of dense settlement. These differences do not create hard boundaries, and migration later blurs many of them, but they help explain why certain blood traits, immune variants, and disease resistances differ in frequency between populations. They also help explain why some health patterns in the present have such deep roots in the past. There is an almost cruel irony in how these evolutionary inheritances play out in the modern world. A trait that once helped survival in a high malaria environment may become harmful when the original disease pressure weakens or medical conditions change. An immune response shaped for one pathogen regime may contribute to inflammatory problems in another. A borrowed archaic variant that once improved defense against Eurasian infection may now be linked with less useful responses in a very different setting. Evolution does not prepare organisms for modernity. It prepares them imperfectly for the local past. The lived reality behind all this is easy to underestimate because it rarely leaves dramatic monuments. Disease does not build ruins. It empties huts, weakens families, shortens childhoods, and narrows the margin between survival and loss. In many African ecologies, biting insects, intestinal parasites, and recurring fevers may have been as decisive in human evolution as drought or migration. In Europe, the annual return of respiratory illness, nutritional weakness through winter, and later crowd diseases in settled communities may have done similar work by other means. The evidence remains incomplete, especially for deep prehistory. But what we can see is enough to shift the whole balance of the story. Human evolution is not only about adapting to landscapes, it is about adapting to the invisible life living inside those landscapes. By now, the divergence between African and European populations is being written in multiple systems at once. Climate has shaped skin and body form. Archaic encounters have altered parts of Eurasian ancestry. Disease has begun pushing immunity and blood biology in different directions. But another force is arriving that will intensify these differences in a more direct and measurable way. It will change diets, childhoods, landscapes, and even the chemistry of digestion. The old foraging world will not disappear completely, but it will be joined by farming, herding, and food systems that create fresh pressures on the body. And among the most striking of those pressures will be one hidden in an ordinary cup of milk. The next great divergence does not begin with bones or skin, but with food. For most of human existence, people eat what landscapes and seasons allow. They hunt, gather, dig, trap, fish, dry, roast, crack, grind, and carry. Their bodies evolve within that older logic, one in which diets are varied, local, and often unstable. Then, in different places and at different times, human beings begin changing the food web itself. Wild grains become crops. Herd animals become managed wealth. Milk, once available only in infancy, becomes a possible adult resource in some societies. The shift is uneven, slow, and never complete. But once it begins, it creates a new kind of evolutionary pressure. People are no longer adapting only to climate and disease. They are adapting to the diets and ecologies they themselves are building. This change matters in both Africa and Europe, though not in the same sequence and not with the same biological outcomes. Farming and herding do not arrive as a single package. Some populations become agricultural early. Some remain foragers for very long stretches. Some combine strategies. Some lean heavily on animals rather than crops. In Africa, cattle pastoralism becomes especially important in a number of regions, while in Europe farming spreads with profound demographic and cultural consequences. The result is not one shared old world food revolution, but several overlapping ones, each creating different selective pressures depending on what people eat, where they live, and how they organize survival. One of the clearest and most famous examples is lactose tolerance, though the name is slightly misleading. All human infants are built to digest lactose, the sugar in milk, because milk is the first food of mammalian life. The more unusual state, biologically speaking, is adult persistence of that ability. In many populations, the production of lactase, the enzyme that digests lactose, declines after weaning. For most of human history, this is not a problem. Adults are not expected to drink fresh milk regularly. But when some societies begin herding animals and relying on their milk as a recurring resource, a new opportunity appears. In those contexts, adults who continue producing lactase gain access to calories, protein, fat, fluid, and nutrients that others cannot exploit as easily. This is one of the rare cases where a cultural innovation creates a strong, direct, and measurable selection pressure on a specific trait. If fresh milk becomes valuable enough, then adults able to digest it may survive hardship better, wean children more flexibly, or endure famine with a nutritional advantage over generations that can drive rapid evolutionary change, and it does. But the remarkable part is that this happens more than once. The ability to digest milk in adulthood evolves independently in different populations, including parts of Europe and parts of Africa, through different genetic mutations. This is one of the strongest examples of convergent evolution in recent human history. Different societies arrive at similar biological solutions because they create similar dietary conditions. Europe's case is especially well known because adult lactose persistence becomes very common in several northern and western populations. This pattern is often linked to the spread of dairying and the nutritional usefulness of milk in environments where growing seasons are limited and sunlight is weaker. Fresh milk and dairy products can help buffer seasonal stress, and in low-light regions the nutritional logic becomes especially attractive. Scholars still debate the exact balance of causes because cultural practices like fermentation and cheese-making reduce lactose content and may allow some milk use even without full lactase persistence. Still, the broad pattern is clear. In much of Europe, especially farther north, strong selection favours adults who can keep digesting lactose. Africa tells a more intricate story. Adult lactose persistence also evolves in several African pastoral populations, particularly in parts of East Africa and some other herding societies, but it does not spread evenly across the continent. This is exactly what one would expect if evolution is responding to local lifeways rather than continental identity. Populations that rely heavily on cattle, camels, or other milk-producing animals may evolve strong tolerance, while neighbouring farming or foraging populations may not. Some African groups with long pastoral traditions show very high frequencies of lactose persistence. Others do not. What survives in the record suggests repeated adaptation tied to herding economies rather than a single African pattern. The continent once again refuses simplification. There is a subtle but important lesson in that. Europeans and Africans do evolve differently in relation to milk, but not because Europeans drink milk and Africans do not, which is the crude stereotype the modern world sometimes repeats. The truth is that both continents contain populations that adapt to dairying, and both contain populations that do not. The difference lies in where and how pastoralism spreads, how useful fresh milk becomes under local conditions, and which mutations rise in frequency. No single explanation fully accounts for every regional pattern, but the overall principle is one of gene-culture coevolution. Human behavior changes the environment. The altered environment changes the value of certain genes. The genes then spread within the cultural system that made them useful in the first place. Food pressure extends far beyond milk. The rise of agriculture alters diet in both Europe and Africa in ways that can reshape bodies and health. Farming often increases calorie stability in one sense, but narrows dietary diversity in another. Populations depending heavily on grains may face different micronutrient pressures from those with more varied foraging diets. Childhood growth can change. Dental health often worsens. Infectious disease can rise with sedentary settlement, even as food storage improves survival during lean periods in Europe. The spread of farming eventually transforms the demographic landscape, bringing not only new foods but new people, new diseases, and new social densities. In Africa, agricultural expansions and pastoral movements do the same in regionally distinct ways. The body must now adapt not only to climate and pathogens, but to cooked starches, stored grains, domesticated animal products, and settled life. Metabolism becomes part of the story here in ways that remain only partly understood. Different long-term diets may shape selection on genes involved in fat processing, starch digestion, insulin response, or nutrient handling, though the evidence is often more complex than popular accounts suggest. Some claims in this area are oversimplified or exaggerated, and scholars still debate how strong many of these selective signals really are. But what survives in the record suggests that the transition to farming and herding does create new physiological pressures, especially when dietary reliance becomes consistent over many generations. Human bodies are flexible, but not infinitely so. Regularly changing the nutritional environment changes which variants are costly, neutral, or advantageous. A lesser-known detail is that cultural workarounds often arrive before biology catches up. People ferment milk into yogurt or cheese. They soak, grind, and cook grains in ways that improve digestibility. They combine foods to reduce deficiencies. They select crop varieties and breeding animals suited to local climates. These practices can soften selection, redirect it, or create new pathways. This is another reminder that biological evolution in humans rarely acts alone. If milk is useful but fresh milk is hard to digest, a culture may invent lower lactose dairy traditions. If a cereal crop is nutritionally weak on its own, food preparation methods may partially compensate. The final biological outcome depends on the interplay between cultural ingenuity and environmental need. Europe's lower sunlight may again sharpen one of these dietary pressures. In weak UV conditions, vitamin D production from the skin is more limited, so food sources that help meet nutritional needs can matter more. This does not mean milk single-handedly explains European evolution, but it may help explain why dairy tolerance becomes especially valuable in some regions. In Africa, by contrast, strong sunlight reduces that specific pressure in many areas, though other nutritional and hydrological advantages of milk remain important in pastoral settings. A herding population in semi-arid country may value milk not because of sunlight, but because it provides fluid and calories in difficult landscapes. The same food can become adaptive for different reasons in different places. The rise of these food systems also changes reproduction and childhood. Weaning patterns shift when animal milk becomes available. Population density may rise when farming stabilizes local food supply, even imperfectly. Earlier weaning can shorten birth intervals in some settings, increasing population growth. But denser populations also bring more disease, more labor demands, and sometimes greater nutritional inequality. Agriculture is not a simple upgrade. It often makes life harder in the body even while making larger societies possible. Skeletons from early farming communities frequently show stress, reduced stature, and heavier disease burden compared with some earlier foragers. Evolutionary success here does not mean comfort. It means persistence under a new regime. By now, the contrast between European and African evolution is becoming impossible to tell as a single straight story. Climate explains some divergence. Disease explains more. Archaic admixture shapes non-African populations in one distinctive way. Then farming, herding, and dairying create fresh local pressures that cut across both continents. Some African pastoral groups and some European farming herding groups evolve similar milk adaptations independently. Some populations remain outside that pattern entirely. Broad continental histories exist, but they are always crossed by regional realities. The body carries these histories in ordinary acts, in the adult who can drink fresh milk without illness, in the child whose growth is shaped by grain, porridge, or herd products rather than wild foods alone, in the population whose diet narrows and must compensate through culture, in the village where food storage allows survival through one bad season and crowd disease through the next. Human evolution is no longer just the story of people entering environments. It is the story of environments remade by people and then pushing back. That pushback will not remain local. Once human populations begin farming, herding, trading, and expanding on larger scales, isolation starts to weaken in some places and intensify in others. Migrations multiply, populations mix, displace, absorb, and redefine one another. Whatever differences Africa and Europe have begun to accumulate will now be complicated by movement, because neither continent is ever allowed to remain still for long. No population stays pure for long unless geography, custom, or sheer distance enforces it, and even then purity is usually more myth than reality. Once people begin moving at larger scales, carrying crops, animals, technologies, and languages with them, the old image of neatly separated continental populations becomes harder and harder to defend. Africa and Europe both continue to evolve differently over time, but they do so while being repeatedly unsettled by migration. That is one of the central tensions in the story. Differences accumulate, yet mixture never stops. Isolation can sharpen local traits, but contact keeps rearranging the human map. Europe is a clear example of this instability. It is often imagined, especially in older racial thinking, as though a single ancestral population formed there in deep prehistory and simply remained European ever since. But what survives in the genetic and archaeological record suggests something far messier. Europe is repeatedly remade by major population movements. Early hunter-gatherers established themselves after the Ice Age in different regions. Later farming populations spread in from Anatolia and the Near East, bringing new lifeways, new genes, and new demographic weight. Later still, pastoralist groups associated with the Eurasian steppe move westward and transform much of the continent again. These are not minor touches on a fixed base. They are demographic turnovers large enough to reshape ancestry across wide areas. That means many traits now associated with Europeans do not descend in a simple straight line from the first Homo sapiens who enter Europe. Some come from early foragers, some rise with later farmers, some spread with steppe-associated peoples, some may increase because a migration brings them, others rise because local conditions favour them after they arrive. Even within Europe, the balance differs from region to region. Southern Europe, Northern Europe, Eastern Europe, Atlantic Europe, and the Mediterranean world all preserve different mixtures of these ancient strands. Scholars still debate the exact timing and scale of some transitions, but no single explanation fully accounts for Europe's later biological profile without repeated migration at the centre of it. Africa, however, is no less dynamic. In fact, in some ways it is more so, because its internal diversity is older and its ecological range wider. One of the most important later movements on the continent is the broad expansion of Bantu-speaking farming populations across large parts of sub-Saharan Africa over many centuries. This movement is not merely linguistic, it carries agriculture, ironworking in many regions, changing settlement patterns, and substantial demographic expansion. As these populations spread, they mix with, displace, or absorb earlier communities to varying degrees depending on place. The result is a transformed African genetic and cultural landscape, but not a uniform one. Forest populations, eastern pastoral groups, Nilotic communities, Khoisan-related populations in the south, and others remain part of a complicated mosaic. The Horn of Africa adds yet another layer. Here, long-standing contacts across the Red Sea and through northeast Africa create histories of mixture involving African and West Eurasian-related ancestries over deep time. North Africa, too, is never isolated from the Mediterranean. The Near East, or later the Arab and Islamic worlds. Sahara crossings. When conditions and trade networks permit, connect populations in ways outsiders often underestimate. The idea of Africa as evolutionary sealed away from Eurasia collapses under the weight of its own history. Contact is frequent enough, and in some places enduring enough, that Africa's later populations cannot be understood without both internal and external movement. This is why continental comparison becomes so difficult after the rise of more complex societies. The farther forward in time one moves, the less useful it is to imagine a single European evolving in one place and a single African evolving in another. Instead, there are populations within populations, each shaped by local ecology and by waves of incomers. A group may preserve very old ancestry in one region, then absorb farmers, herders, traders, or conquerors later. Another may remain relatively isolated for longer. Another may sit directly on a corridor of exchange and become a genetic crossroads. What survives in the record suggests that both continents are best understood as layered palimpsests, histories written over older histories without ever fully erasing them. There is also a paradox in how migration affects evolution. On one hand, migration can reduce local differentiation by bringing genes from elsewhere and widening the pool of variation. On the other hand, migration can introduce entirely new traits into an environment where selection then acts on them. A population may become more mixed overall while still evolving in a more distinctive local direction, because new variants now exist for natural selection to work on. This is one reason later European evolution cannot be reduced to climate acting on one isolated Ice Age remnant, nor can African evolution be reduced to ancient continuity untouched by outside influence. Movement feeds adaptation as much as it disrupts it. A striking example lies again in pigmentation and lactose tolerance. Traits associated with lighter skin in Europe do not simply emerge from the first northern populations and remain fixed. Some appear to spread more strongly with later farming groups and perhaps intensify under local selection. Lactase persistence likewise rises in some regions and populations because of a combination of migration, culture, and selection. In Africa, pastoralist groups carrying adult milk digestion traits may spread or mix, but the final distribution still depends on local subsistence systems and demographic history. Migration does not erase evolution. It gives evolution new ingredients. Trade routes add another dimension to this process because people do not only migrate in large replacement waves, they also move in smaller but continuous flows: merchants, captives, pastoralists, brides, raiders, soldiers, pilgrims, refugees, across the Mediterranean, the Nile corridor, the Sahara, the Indian Ocean coast, and later the Atlantic system. Human beings are constantly crossing ecological and cultural boundaries. Some of these movements leave only faint traces. Others alter whole regions. The biological consequences are cumulative. A little ancestry from one direction here, another from elsewhere later, and a population's profile begins to shift in ways no ancient observer could have predicted. A lesser-known but revealing truth is that isolated populations often preserve unusual evolutionary signals precisely because so much else around them is mixed. Mountain groups, desert edge communities, islands, rainforest specialists, or socially endogamous populations can retain older ancestry or distinctive adaptations longer than surrounding populations. Europe has its refugees and isolates. Africa has many more, given its size and ecological complexity. These groups matter because they remind us that broad continental histories are averages drawn across many exceptions. Some people live at crossroads, others live at edges where older patterns endure. This constant movement also weakens any attempt to map biology neatly onto language or culture. A language can spread faster than genes. A conquering elite can impose customs without replacing most of the population. A farming way of life can be adopted by local groups without mass migration. Or it can spread through substantial migration, or both in different places. In Africa and Europe alike, the fit between culture and ancestry is often partial. This is another reason modern categories become so misleading when projected backward. The people who look similar may not share recent ancestry. The people who speak related languages may come from different biological backgrounds. The people who carry older local ancestry may now live under newer identities. Human history is full of mismatches. And yet, despite all this mixing, broad differences can still persist because migration never falls evenly across geography. Northern Europe still remains, on average, lower in ultraviolet radiation than tropical Africa. Malaria still exerts stronger pressure in some African ecologies than in most of Europe. Pastoral lifeways still matter more in some regions than others. Repeated exposure to certain climates, foods, and diseases continues shaping populations even while new ancestry arrives. This is how both statements can be true at once. Europeans and Africans evolve differently over time, and neither group is ever biologically fixed or homogeneous. The old fantasy of clean separation is therefore wrong in two directions. It underestimates real adaptation and it underestimates real mixing. It imagines differences as permanent essences rather than moving outcomes. Europe becomes what it becomes through layers of foragers, farmers, pastoralists, and countless later mixtures. Africa becomes what it becomes through much older internal diversity, major expansions, regional isolation, repeated admixture, and ongoing exchange with Eurasia and within the continent itself. Neither story is simple. Both are histories of motion. If one looks at a map of the ancient world long enough, it begins to seem less like a set of continents, and more like a breathing system of corridors and pauses. Rivers pull people inward, deserts hold them back until wet phases or caravan routes reopen passage. Coasts invite small-scale movement that accumulates over centuries. Mountain ranges shelter, isolates and redirect flows. The sea divides and connects at the same time. Human evolution in Africa and Europe is happening through all of this, not outside it. By now, then, the question is no longer just what different environments did to separate populations. It is also what evidence allows us to reconstruct such a tangled story without falling back on myth. Bones, stones, genomes, isotopes, ancient pathogens, and buried landscapes all begin speaking together. None speaks perfectly, many disagree, but taken together, they let scholars trace where people moved, what they ate, whom they mixed with, and which traits changed over time. The next step in the story belongs to that evidence itself, because without it, the human past is too easy to simplify into something it never was. The farther one moves into the human past, the less the story survives in words and the more it survives in fragments. A tooth buried in cave sediment, a skull altered by pressure and time. Traces of fire in an occupation layer, a shard of bone carrying chemical signatures from a childhood landscape far away. DNA preserved by luck inside dense petrous bone. Pollen trapped in old mud. Parasite remains in ancient waste. Shorelines now inland, rivers now dry, grasslands now forest, forests now dust. None of these pieces explains the past alone, but together they form the strange machinery by which scholars reconstruct how Europeans and Africans evolved differently over time. Without this machinery, the story would collapse into guesswork and myth very quickly. For most of modern scholarship, bones came first. Skeletal remains allowed early researchers to compare body proportions, cranial form, limb length, robusticity, dental wear, signs of disease, and developmental stress. From this evidence came some of the first serious attempts to understand how climate and lifestyle shape the human body. A skeleton from a cold-adapted population could suggest more compact proportions. A skeleton from a mobile foraging population might show different mechanical stresses from one shaped by agricultural labour. Teeth could reveal weaning patterns, diet abrasiveness, disease episodes, and periods of childhood disruption. Yet bones are both powerful and deceptive. They preserve unevenly, often in tiny samples, and what survives may not represent entire populations. Scholars still debate many interpretations because skeletal evidence, though valuable, can rarely tell the whole story on its own. Archaeology widened that story. Stone tools, hearths, ornaments, grinding stones, fishing gear, burial practices, and traces of dwellings made it possible to place bodies within ways of life. A compact skeleton in a cold region means one thing if found with signs of high mobility, another if found in a more settled context. Evidence of marine diets can change how researchers interpret vitamin pressures in northern populations. Herding tools and animal remains can illuminate why lactose persistence later becomes advantageous. Burial goods and symbolic materials hint at the social complexity surrounding biological adaptation. Evolution is never just a matter of isolated organisms. Archaeology reminds us that people adapt as communities, with technologies and traditions that shape what biology must solve. Then came ancient DNA, and with it the collapse of many older certainties. Genetic analysis has transformed the study of human history because it can reveal ancestry, population mixing, some visible traits, immune-related variants, and broad demographic shifts with a clarity earlier generations could barely imagine. It showed that Europe's population history is not a simple continuity from early Ice Age settlers, but a layered sequence involving hunter-gatherers, incoming farmers, steppe-associated peoples, and multiple later mixtures. It confirmed that people outside Africa carry Neanderthal ancestry. It helped trace the timing of some pigmentation changes, the spread of lactase persistence, and the extraordinary depth of African genetic diversity. In some cases, ancient DNA has not merely refined old models, it has overturned them. And yet genetic evidence also has limits, some of them especially important in Africa. DNA preservation is much poorer in many warm and humid environments, which means ancient African population history is harder to reconstruct directly than that of colder Eurasian regions where genetic material often survives longer. This can create a false impression that Europe's past is simply clearer or more eventful. In reality, Africa's past may be equally or more complex, but the evidence is often harder to retrieve. The result is an imbalance in what scholars can say with confidence. Europe's demographic history has been mapped in dazzling detail in some periods, while Africa's deeper story often requires more indirect inference from living populations, archaeology, and limited ancient samples. The evidence remains incomplete, and this incompleteness matters. One of the most revealing tools in recent decades has been isotopic analysis. Human bones and teeth carry chemical signals influenced by diet and local geology. These signals can indicate whether a person grew up in one region and later moved to another, whether their food came mostly from marine or terrestrial sources, or whether they relied heavily on certain plant systems. In practical terms, isotopes allow scholars to see migration and subsistence in individual lives. A person buried in one place may chemically belong to another. A farming village may contain individuals with varied childhood origins. A coastal population may reveal unexpectedly mixed diets. This matters because it grounds the story of adaptation in lived movement rather than abstract population labels. Paleoclimate reconstruction is equally crucial, because without the environment the body makes little sense. Sediment cores, ice cores, fossil pollen, lake levels, cave deposits, and ancient shorelines help scholars rebuild the worlds in which human evolution unfolds. They show when the Sahara is greener, when drought intensifies, when European cold phases deepen, when forests retreat, when coastlines move, and when animal communities shift. A genetic change related to pigmentation, immunity, or diet means little without knowing the climate and ecology around it. No single explanation fully accounts for human difference unless the physical world is placed back around the people who lived through it. There is also a quieter science at work in the background, the study of pathogens and stress in ancient remains. Lesions on bone can sometimes suggest chronic disease, though many infections leave no skeletal trace. Ancient parasite eggs preserved in sediments or latrine remains can reveal what burdened past populations. Dental enamel defects can indicate episodes of severe stress during childhood. Growth patterns can reflect nutritional instability. These clues rarely provide dramatic certainty, but they help scholars understand which pressures were likely strong enough to influence survival and selection. When combined with genetics, archaeology, and climate data. They let an older, invisible history begin to come into view. A lesser-known but deeply important truth is that the strongest conclusions often come not from one spectacular discovery, but from convergence. A single genome can mislead, a single skeleton can be atypical, a single archaeological site can be unusual. But when independent lines of evidence begin pointing in the same direction, confidence grows. If ancient DNA suggests a migration, isotopes show movement, archaeology shows new subsistence patterns, and paleoclimate data reveal a corridor open at the right time, then a once fragile hypothesis becomes far stronger. This is how the best reconstructions of African and European evolutionary history are built not from one miracle find, but from overlapping signals that support one another across disciplines. Still, evidence can only answer certain kinds of questions. It can reveal that a variant linked to lighter pigmentation increases in frequency. It can show that a population mixed with another. It can indicate that dairying became important, or that a skeleton grew up in a different region from where it was buried. But it cannot always tell exactly how people understood themselves, how they ranked visible difference, or how identity felt on the ground. Biology survives better than social perception. That gap matters, because later racial ideas often pretend to describe timeless realities, when in fact they are much newer interpretations laid over older biological variation. The record can show bodies changing. It cannot fully tell us what these bodies meant to the people inhabiting them. This is one reason caution is so important. The tools of modern science are powerful, but the human temptation to overread them is just as powerful. A population cluster in a genetic chart can be mistaken for a permanent racial block. A climate-linked body proportion can be inflated into a stereotype. A trait common in one region can be misunderstood as universal there. Serious scholarship resists these leaps. What survives in the record suggests patterns, tendencies, migrations, admixture, and adaptations. It does not justify simplistic hierarchies or timeless categories. The better the evidence becomes, the more complicated the human story usually turns out to be. And that complication is, in a strange way, the strongest finding of all. Europe's evolutionary history is revealed not as one people in one place, but as a series of mixtures under changing climates. Africa's history appears not as background to the real story of outward migration, but as the deepest and most varied human archive on Earth. Traits once assumed to be ancient and fixed turn out to be relatively recent. Boundaries once imagined as clean turn out to be porous. Even visible contrasts like skin color, when placed under scientific light, become records of local adaptation rather than evidence of separate origins. The tools keep pulling certainty apart, and in doing so they bring the real story closer. There is something almost moving in that process. The past is mostly gone, and yet the body keeps betraying it. A mutation in living people points back to ancient dairying. A small Neanderthal-derived sequence points to a meeting tens of thousands of years ago. A skeleton's limb proportions recall generations under heat or cold. A child's tooth enamel preserves the chemistry of a vanished landscape. Buried dust remembers rain that stopped falling long before cities existed. The record is broken, but not silent. With that evidence in hand, one conclusion becomes unavoidable. The old habit of speaking about Europeans and Africans as if they were simple. Natural categories tells only the faintest part of the truth. The data do not support neat blocks. They support deep diversity, repeated movement, and adaptation at multiple scales. Before the story can go further, that illusion has to be confronted directly, because much of the damage in thinking about human evolution comes not from lack of evidence, but from forcing evidence into categories too blunt to hold it. By the time the evidence is laid out properly, the most familiar categories begin to look strangely fragile. European and African are useful words in some contexts. They describe geography, they describe some broad historical patterns, they can point toward average differences in ancestry, pigmentation, disease exposure, or climate adaptation. But when those words are treated as if they name timeless biological kinds, the human story begins to distort. The distortion is not small. It reaches back into the interpretation of bones, genes, migration, even survival itself, and for much of modern history, it has done real damage. The problem begins with scale. Evolution acts on populations living in particular environments under particular conditions. A coastal community in Eastern Africa, a highland group in Ethiopia, a rainforest foraging population in Central Africa, and a pastoral population in the Sahel are not interchangeable units simply because they occupy the same continent. The same is true in Europe. A Mesolithic forager in Iberia, an early farmer in the Balkans, a steppe-derived pastoralist in Eastern Europe, and a later population in Scandinavia do not share one single evolutionary experience. Each inherits something different, mixes with different neighbours, and lives under different pressures. Continental labels flatten this richness into a silhouette. That flattening can be useful for broad explanation, but it becomes dangerous when people forget that it is flattening. One reason race-based thinking has been so persistent is that visible differences, especially skin colour, seem to invite simple grouping. The eye notices contrast and assumes essence, but the scientific record keeps undermining that assumption. Populations can differ strikingly in one visible trait and still overlap deeply in ancestry. They can share similar traits for different reasons. They can acquire the same adaptation independently. They can mix repeatedly without losing local patterns altogether. What survives in the record suggests not separate biological worlds, but gradients, clusters, corridors, and histories of movement. Even genetics, which is often treated by the public as the final authority, does not rescue simple categories. Genetic data absolutely show population structure, geography matters, ancestry matters, historical separation matters. It would be false to pretend that all human populations are genetically identical in the distribution of traits or ancestry. But it would be equally false to imagine those differences sorting cleanly into rigid natural boxes. Most human variation is shared across populations. Much of the variation that does differ does so gradually across geography, rather than through hard boundaries. And within Africa in particular, diversity is so deep that the category itself often contains more internal variation than older racial systems ever knew how to acknowledge. This is one reason Africa creates such difficulty for simple racial models. If one imagines Africans as one uniform ancestral type, the evidence immediately begins to resist. Genetic divergence between some African populations can be ancient and substantial, reflecting long periods of separation, adaptation, and later reconnection. Morphology, language, subsistence, and disease ecology vary enormously across the continent. Africa is not just another continental branch next to Europe. It is the deepest reservoir of human diversity, and that means any simple Europe versus Africa comparison starts from an imbalance in complexity. Europe's population history is layered and dynamic, but Africa's is older, broader, and in many ways even less suited to reduction. Europe, too, becomes misleading when imagined as a single biological identity. Modern Europeans are the product of repeated ancestry shifts, including hunter-gatherer populations, early farmers with roots in Anatolia and nearby regions, steppe-associated groups, and many later historical admixtures. Even traits now strongly associated with Europe, such as very light pigmentation or high lactose persistence in some regions, do not define all Europeans and do not descend from one ancient European essence. They rise, spread, mix, and change in frequency through time. A person who looks obviously European today would not map neatly onto much of Europe's earlier population history. In a deep time sense, Europe itself is a moving target. There is also a conceptual mistake built into many everyday discussions of difference. They assume that if a trait differs on average between populations, then that trait must define the populations. But average difference is not the same thing as total identity. Height varies across populations, yet tall and short individuals exist in all of them. Lactase persistence varies, but not every pastoral population has it, and not every person in a high-frequency population carries it. Pigmentation differs, but with wide ranges and complex ancestry behind it. Disease resistance may be elevated in one region for one pathogen, and absent in another for reasons tied to ecology, not worth or capacity. Evolution creates patterns, not destinies. It shapes distributions, not moral categories. Scholars still debate how best to communicate this without falling into two opposite errors. One error is biological essentialism, which turns real population history into rigid, hierarchical types. The other is a kind of overcorrection that pretends human biological variation is too small or too politically sensitive to discuss honestly. Serious science rejects both. Human variation is real. It is historically meaningful. It includes adaptations to climate, disease, diet, and altitude. But it does not map cleanly onto the racial categories modern societies invented. And it certainly does not justify those categories' old claims about intelligence, virtue, civilization, or worth. No single explanation fully accounts for why modern people keep confusing population history with race ideology, but visibility, politics, and colonial history have all played their part. One of the lesser-known consequences of this confusion is how it has distorted research itself. Earlier anthropology often assumed that visible physical difference must correspond to deep, stable racial lineages. That assumption led scholars to overvalue certain skull measurements, overstate typological thinking, and overlook migration and mixing. More recent work, especially with ancient DNA and better archaeology, has repeatedly shown that populations once treated as stable racial units were anything but stable. Europe changed dramatically. Africa was never uniform. North Africa and the Horn were crossroads. The Mediterranean blurred continents. The Sahara alternated between barrier and bridge. The categories were always cleaner on paper than in bodies. The lived reality was almost certainly even more fluid than the science can recover. People marry neighbours and strangers. They absorb outsiders. They move under pressure. They adopt languages. They leave children in frontier zones and trade towns. They survive conquest without vanishing genetically. They disappear culturally while leaving biological traces. The farther back one goes, the less likely it becomes that anyone understands themselves as part of a continental biological block. They understand kin, place, language, lifeway, enemies, allies, and perhaps broad outsiders, but not modern race in its later form. That system belongs to a much younger world, and yet the temptation to read it backward remains strong. It offers a false clarity. It turns the dense and unstable human past into a set of familiar labels. It makes explanation feel easy. but easy explanation is usually a warning sign. When scholars examine the evidence carefully, the picture that emerges is less tidy but more interesting. Europeans and Africans do evolve differently over time in some real and measurable ways. Those differences involve sunlight, climate, disease ecologies, food systems, archaic admixture outside Africa, migration, and local adaptation. But neither Europeans nor Africans have ever been singular biological entities in the simple sense. They are historical assemblages, not primordial types. This matters for more than accuracy. It changes the moral tone of the whole story. If human variation is understood as adaptation under different conditions, then difference loses much of the mystical and political weight later societies tried to force onto it. Dark skin becomes a solar solution, not a civilizational marker. Light skin becomes a low UV adaptation, not a sign of origin-level separation. Lactase persistence becomes a response to dairying, not a measure of advancement. Immune variants become records of local disease burdens, not evidence of superior constitution. The body stops being a banner and becomes what it really is, a historical document. There is something humbling in that realization. The traits modern people use to classify one another so quickly are often local answers to old ecological problems. They're contingent. They could have been otherwise, under different skies, with different foods, on different migration routes. The human map would look different too. That does not make the traits unreal. It makes them contextual. The evidence remains incomplete in places, especially in Africa's deeper past. But enough is known now to say this with confidence. Simple categories hide more than they reveal. So when asking how Europeans and Africans evolved differently over time, the better question may be how much difference can accumulate within one interconnected species before people begin mistaking adaptation for essence. The answer, it turns out, is quite a lot. Enough to be visible. Enough to matter medically and historically. Enough to shape local lives. But not enough to divide humanity into separate natural ranks. The closer the science gets, the more that illusion falls away. And once it falls away, what remains is more difficult and more compelling. One species, spread across radically different worlds, continually changing, continually mixing, continually producing new local forms without ever ceasing to be one humankind. The next part of the story will return to the visible present, where some of those old adaptations still linger in everyday traits, sometimes useful, sometimes costly, and often misunderstood by the societies that inherit them. Those ancient pressures are not gone. They survive in fragments, in frequencies, in small biological tendencies still visible in the present if one knows where to look, not as destiny, not as perfect boundaries, and certainly not as a complete explanation of who anyone is, but as echoes of old environments still carried in living bodies. A person walking through a modern city may carry within them adaptations shaped by Ice Age winters, tropical disease ecologies, highland air, pastoral diets, or ancient encounters far older than any written record. The past does not disappear. It settles into the ordinary. Skin remains the clearest example because it is still the first thing many people notice, even now. Broadly speaking, many populations with deep ancestry in regions of high ultraviolet radiation retain darker pigmentation, while many populations with long histories in Northern Europe retain lighter pigmentation, better suited to lower ultraviolet environments. That much is real. But even in the present, the pattern is more fluid than stereotype suggests. North Africa, the Horn of Africa, Southern Europe, and regions shaped by historical migration all show wide ranges. Urbanization and recent population movement have made the human map more visibly mixed than ever. The biology of pigmentation still reflects ancient selective pressures, but the social world around that biology has changed faster than the trait itself. Lactose persistence is another powerful survival of the past, and in some ways a more surprising one because it hides in something as ordinary as a glass of milk. In many northern and western European populations, adult lactose digestion is common enough to feel unremarkable. In several African pastoral populations, it is also common, though often for different genetic reasons. Elsewhere in both continents, it is much rarer. The modern distribution still reflects old histories of dairying, herd dependence, famine buffering, and local food systems. Yet modern food culture can disguise this. Refrigeration, fermentation, food processing, and global trade make dairy consumption feel universal in some places, even though the underlying ability to digest fresh milk as an adult remains highly uneven across the world. Disease-related traits may be even more important, though less visible. In parts of Africa where malaria exerted strong selective pressure, red blood cell variants such as sickle cell trait or other malaria-associated adaptations remain present because of that history. They are not symbols of identity. They are residues of survival in deadly disease environments. In the modern world, especially where malaria declines or medical care changes the balance of risk, these same traits can become painful examples of evolution's indifference. A variant once maintained because it helped in one context may cause serious illness in another. The body is carrying an old bargain into a new world. Europe preserves its own old bargains. Some immune-related variants associated with Neanderthal ancestry remain in present-day non-African populations, including Europeans. And researchers continue studying how these archaic inheritances affect modern immunity, inflammation, skin biology, and disease risk. The exact significance of any one variant can be difficult to pin down, and scholars still debate many of the details. But the larger truth is striking enough on its own. People alive today may carry pieces of another human lineage because that lineage once offered useful biological material in Eurasian environments. The inheritance is ancient, tiny in proportion, and still not entirely understood, but it is real. There are also subtler present-day patterns in body form and physiology that likely reflect long-term climatic histories, even if modern life blurs them. Population-level differences in body proportions, heat tolerance, cold tolerance, or metabolic response can persist for some time after the original environment has changed, especially when the traits are distributed through ancestry rather than shaped only by immediate childhood conditions. But this is where caution is essential. Modern nutrition, medicine, urban life, intermarriage, and developmental plasticity complicate the picture enormously. A child raised in London, Lagos, Paris, Nairobi, or Berlin is not a simple expression of deep ancestry alone. Growth, health, class, environment, and migration history all intervene. That is why some of the most interesting surviving differences are not the dramatic ones, but the quiet mismatches between ancient adaptation and modern circumstances. Skin adapted for strong sunlight may now live in weak light northern cities, raising different questions about vitamin D and health. Light skin adapted for low ultraviolet conditions may now spend generations in high UV settings, with different implications for skin damage. Dietary traits shaped under pastoralism or grain dependence may encounter entirely new industrial food environments. Immune systems tuned by older disease burdens may react strangely in cleaner or more medically transformed conditions. No single explanation fully accounts for modern health patterns, but the past still helps set the background. A lesser-known example lies in altitude and oxygen handling. Some African populations with long histories in highland environments show physiological adjustments that differ from those found in high-altitude populations elsewhere in the world. These are not usually visible in casual life, but they matter as evidence of how local adaptation persists across time. Similar patterns appear with some disease resistances and nutritional tolerances. The modern person inherits not one grand continental identity, but a bundle of old local negotiations, some still relevant, some partly obsolete, some only noticeable under scientific examination. This becomes especially important in medicine, where average population histories can matter without defining individuals. Certain genetic variants connected to disease risk, drug metabolism, blood traits, or nutritional handling occur at different frequencies in different ancestry groups because of their evolutionary past. Ignoring that can be dangerous, but using it carelessly can be just as dangerous, because ancestry-based averages are not precise substitutes for individual diagnosis. The modern world often swings awkwardly between denying human biological variation for fear of misuse and overstating it for simplistic categorization. Serious understanding requires holding both truths at once. Old adaptations still matter, and no individual can be reduced to population averages. The everyday present is full of these inherited traces. In a northern European population where pale skin and milk digestion are common, one is seeing the long afterlife of weak sunlight and dairying. In an African population where malaria-associated variants remain frequent, one is seeing centuries and millennia of deadly ecological pressure. In communities shaped by recent migration, one may see combinations that would once have been geographically unlikely, now living side by side, and sometimes within the same person. The human story has entered an age where movement is faster than local adaptation can easily track. That makes the old patterns more visible in one sense and less predictive in another. There is something almost haunting about how ordinary these ancient survivals can seem. A child drinks milk with no difficulty because pastoral ancestors once depended on livestock. Another cannot digest it well because their ancestors had no reason to evolve that ability. Someone burns quickly under strong sun because their pigmentation history formed under cloudier skies. Someone else carries protection against a disease that is no longer common where they live, yet still bears the cost of the trait. Another person inherits a tiny fragment of Neanderthal DNA and never knows it except as a line in a lab result or a statistical contribution to immunity. The deepest past is often hidden inside the most ordinary acts. And still, the modern world keeps trying to turn these traces into stories bigger than they are. A real adaptation becomes a stereotype, a frequency becomes a rule, a population tendency becomes a claim about behavior, intelligence, or value. This is where the danger returns, because once present-day differences are noticed, they can be recruited again into old hierarchies, but the evidence refuses to cooperate with that misuse. Most of these traits are local solutions to local problems. Many come with trade-offs. Some appear in both Africa and Europe through different routes. Others vary more within continents than people expect. The biology is interesting precisely because it is contingent, not because it confirms simple identities. So the present does preserve ancient divergences, but in fragments and with friction. The old environments still speak through the body, though often quietly. Europe still bears the marks of low light, cold season history, repeated migration, and archaic admixture. Africa still bears the marks of deeper human diversity, stronger solar regimes in many regions, heavy disease selection in some ecologies, pastoral innovations in others, and multiple internal histories unfolding at once. Yet the modern person stands at the far end of all that complexity, not as a pure representative of a continent, but as a living summary of many pressures layered over time, which is why the final challenge is not simply to understand these differences, but to understand how they have been misunderstood. The science itself is complicated enough. The politics built around it are worse. For centuries, human evolutionary difference has been misread as proof of rank, value, and destiny. The next step in the story has to confront that directly, because the misuse of difference has shaped the modern world almost as much as the differences themselves. By the time modern science begins trying to explain human difference, older societies have already spent centuries inventing reasons to misuse it. That misuse does not arise because the differences are imaginary. It arises because real differences are easier to politicize than complex truths. Skin can be seen, bodies can be compared, disease burdens, visible traits, and ancestry patterns can be measured. And from those facts, people have repeatedly tried to build something the evidence does not support a ladder of human worth. This is where the history of European and African evolution becomes dangerous in the wrong hands, because adaptation can be turned into ideology with alarming speed. The logic of that ideology is almost always the same. A population-level trait is observed. The trait is exaggerated into a defining essence. That essence is linked to behavior, intelligence, morality, civilization, or capacity. Hierarchy is then declared natural. Once this happens, history is rewritten to serve power. Environmental adaptation becomes destiny. Local physiological trade-offs become permanent civilizational verdicts. The body stops being evidence of survival under particular conditions and becomes, in political imagination, proof of what a people supposedly is. Serious scholarship has spent generations dismantling this pattern, but the pattern remains stubborn because it flatters those who benefit from it. Europe played a central role in constructing these hierarchies, especially during the age of empire, slavery, colonial rule, and scientific racism. By then, visible differences between many Europeans and many Africans were already obvious enough to be weaponized. Lighter skin was recast as purity, advancement, rationality. Darker skin was recast as primitiveness, labor, sensuality, or inferiority. None of this came from evolutionary biology. It came from political systems seeking moral permission for domination. But once the hierarchy was invented, people went searching for science to legitimize it. Skulls were measured, bodies were ranked, intelligence was claimed to be written into anatomy, geography was mistaken for destiny, a false narrative of natural inequality was built from selected fragments of real human variation. The tragedy is not only that the science was morally corrupt, it was also scientifically poor. Many early racial classifications treated populations as fixed, pure, and bounded in ways the evidence no longer supports. They ignored migration, admixture, local adaptation, and the extraordinary internal diversity of Africa. They confused visible difference with total difference. They elevated superficial traits over deeper and more relevant biological realities. And they often assumed that European history represented the universal standard by which all others should be judged. In that framework, traits shaped by African climates or disease ecologies were not understood as successful adaptations. They were framed as departures from a European norm that had no right to be treated as universal in the first place. One of the most powerful corrections modern science has made is to show that human populations are better understood through ancestry, adaptation, and history than through the rigid racial types older thinkers preferred. Skin pigmentation, for example, is now understood as a solar adaptation with repeated evolutionary logic, not as a marker of intellectual or moral capacity. Lactase persistence is a dietary adaptation tied to pastoralism, not a sign of advancement. Immune-related variants reflect local pathogen histories, not inherent superiority. Neanderthal ancestry in non-African populations does not make those populations more advanced, more ancient, or less human. These are all historical outcomes, not rankings. Scholars still debate many important details within this broader framework. They debate how to interpret some population clusters, how much weight to place on certain genetic differences, how much developmental environment shapes adult outcomes relative to ancestry, and how best to describe biological variation without feeding old prejudices. These debates are real and ongoing, but they take place within a very different intellectual world from the old racial typologies. No serious body of evidence supports the notion that the evolutionary differences between Europeans and Africans add up to natural hierarchy. No single explanation fully accounts for every trait distribution, but the evidence is more than sufficient to reject claims of ranked humankinds. There is also a subtler misuse that persists even when people avoid explicit hierarchy. This is the habit of turning statistical difference into narrative fate. A group average becomes the supposed explanation for everything that group experiences: health disparities, educational outcomes, wealth, violence, or social instability are then attributed to inherited biological tendencies rather than to history, institutions, exploitation, diet, medicine, environment, or policy. Evolution becomes a convenient excuse for refusing more difficult explanations. This kind of thinking often sounds more modern than older racism because it borrows the language of genes and adaptation, but it repeats the same basic mistake. It mistakes what is measurable for what is morally or socially decisive. Africa's evolutionary history is especially vulnerable to distortion because it has so often been viewed through European eyes trained by empire. The continent's deep human diversity, long disease selection, climatic complexity, and multiple demographic histories can be described in a way that emphasizes adaptation and richness, or in a way that exoticizes and pathologizes. The difference lies not in the facts alone, but in the frame imposed on them. A population carrying malaria-related variants can be described as burdened by a defective trait, or as shaped by a brutal ecological pressure that selected one of evolution's harsh but effective compromises. A difference in pigmentation can be turned into cultural myth, or understood simply as the body balancing sunlight's risks and necessities. The facts do not choose the meaning. People do. Europe, too, has been mythologized through misuse of evolutionary language. Cold adaptation, lighter pigmentation, and certain technological trajectories have been folded into stories of inherent superiority or singular civilizational destiny. But Europe's biological history does not support such myths. It is full of admixture, replacement, dependence on borrowed crops and animals, and adaptations to narrow climatic conditions rather than some universal human ideal. A body adapted to low ultraviolet radiation is not more advanced than one adapted to strong ultraviolet radiation. A population with high lactose persistence is not biologically superior to one without it. A history of Neanderthal introgression is not a badge of distinction. These are simply different outcomes under different pressures. A lesser known but revealing sign of how weak the hierarchical model really is lies in trade-offs. Many adaptations come with costs. Sickle cell trait helps in malarial environments but can cause severe disease in homozygous form. Light skin aids, vitamin D production in low UV settings, but increases vulnerability to sun damage in high UV conditions. Immune variants protective in one disease regime may contribute to inflammatory disorders in another. Lactose persistence is useful where milk is a major resource, but irrelevant where it is not. Evolution does not distribute blessings. It distributes compromises. The body is full of bargains, and bargains are poor material for moral ranking. This is why the political misuse of human difference so often depends on ignoring context. Strip a trait out of its environment and it can be made to mean almost anything. Put it back into context and the false grandeur drains away. Dark skin under intense sun is not a mark of inferiority. It is excellent engineering for that setting. Light skin under weak northern sunlight is not a mark of superiority. It is a solution to a very different problem. Adult milk digestion is not a sign of progress. It is a response to dairying. Stockier bodies in cold climates and leaner bodies in hotter ones are not grades of humanity. They are thermal negotiations. Perhaps the most important correction of all is that the same species under different conditions can produce meaningful difference without producing separate natural ranks. This should not be a difficult idea, and yet history shows how difficult it has been in practice. Part of the problem is that human beings are storytellers before they are scientists. Once they see difference, they seek significance. Once they seek significance, they are tempted by hierarchy because hierarchy simplifies. It tells people who belongs above and below. It offers order at the expense of truth. The scientific picture offers something harder: complexity without moral ranking, variation without destiny, adaptation without hierarchy. The evidence also undermines another comforting illusion, which is that misuse belongs only to the past. It does not. Today the language is often more coded. People invoke ancestry, genetics, biology, or evolution in selective ways to explain social outcomes they have already decided must be natural. Fringe theories flourish online. Old racial myths reappear under new vocabulary. Popular misunderstandings of DNA tests encourage people to think in cleaner categories than the science permits. In that sense, the history of how Europeans and Africans evolved differently remains politically alive. The facts still matter because the distortions still matter. And yet there is kind of hope in the science too. The more closely human variation is studied, the less it supports the fantasies built around it. Africa emerges as the deepest center of human diversity, not a deviation from the human norm. Europe emerges as a dynamic, mixed, repeatedly reshaped region, not a timeless biological essence. Adaptations once treated as markers of rank become evidence of local survival. The very tools once misused to sort humanity have become, in better hands, tools for undoing those false divisions. So the real lesson of difference is not that it must be denied, but that it must be interpreted properly. Europeans and Africans do evolve differently over time. That is true, but the differences are historical, ecological, and partial. They are not a ladder. They are not a prophecy. They are not a justification. They are the marks left on one species by the fact that it survived in more than one kind of world. What remains, after the misuse is stripped away, is both simpler and more profound. Human beings changed because they had to, under bright skies, under dim ones, among parasites, among herds, across coasts, in forests, on steppe, in villages, in drought, in cold. They adjusted and carried on. The final shape of the story is not separation into rival kinds, but convergence after divergence, one species, altered by place and time, still recognizably itself. In the end, this story refuses to become what so many people have wanted it to be. It does not become a tale of separate creations, nor a contest between fixed human types, nor a ladder leading upward from one body to another. It becomes something older, slower, and far more unsettling in its implications. Europeans and Africans do evolve differently over time, sometimes visibly, sometimes in ways hidden deep in physiology, but they do so as branches of the same restless species, each shaped by particular landscapes, diseases, foods, migrations, and accidents of history. The divergence is real. The separation is never complete. The connection remains deeper than the difference. That is perhaps the most important truth left standing after all the evidence, all the old misuse, all the arguments about ancestry and adaptation. The ancestors of Europeans do not emerge from some separate northern beginning. They come from Africa, from the same broad human source as everyone else, then pass through bottlenecks, strange climates, repeated migrations, and encounters with other humans outside Africa. The ancestors of Africans do not stand still as a kind of background population waiting for history to happen elsewhere. They remain inside the oldest and richest human landscape on Earth, continuing to diversify, mix, adapt, and survive under conditions as varied as almost anything the species will ever face. Europe becomes one later theatre of human evolution. Africa remains the deeper archive. Seen this way, the contrast between the two is not a contradiction but a structure. Africa preserves the widest genetic diversity because it carries the oldest continuity of Homo sapiens and the broadest range of environments in which that continuity unfolds. Europe, populated later by subsets of that older variation, experiences stronger bottlenecks, lower ultraviolet light, colder climates, more intense seasonal constraints, and a major contribution from archaic Eurasian humans. Then both continents are transformed again and again by farming, herding, disease, and migration. The result is not a clean Europe and a clean Africa. It is a long process in which average differences emerge through repeated local pressures, while both continents remain full of exceptions, mixtures, and regional histories that resist simplification. There is a temptation, even now, to ask what all of this adds up to in plain terms. If one strips away the categories and looks only at the biology, the answer is surprisingly direct. Many African populations remain, on average, more strongly shaped by long-term selection under high ultraviolet conditions, heavy disease ecologies in some regions, and the deep internal diversification of the species' homeland. Many European populations remain, on average, more strongly shaped by low ultraviolet conditions, colder and more seasonal environments, repeated demographic turnover, and the small but significant inheritance of archaic Eurasian humans. Certain visible differences become common. Certain dietary traits rise. Certain disease-related variants persist. Certain body proportions appear more often, but all of it remains variation inside one species, not evidence of separate human kinds. That phrase matters one species. It is easy to say and harder to feel in a world that has spent so long arranging humanity into oppositions, yet the whole record points back to it. Europeans and Africans can intermarry fully because the divergence between them never approaches speciation. They share the overwhelming majority of their biology. Their differences are recent when measured against the deeper span of life on Earth, and even recent within the long life of Homo sapiens. Many of the traits people now treat as ancient continental signatures turn out to be young, contingent, and subject to change. Skin pigmentation shifts with sunlight, milk digestion shifts with dairying, immune profiles shift with pathogens, bodies shift with climate, labour, and diet. change the world around a population, and over time the body changes too. There is also something quietly democratic in that realization. Human variation is not a set of badges earned by worth. It is the residue of survival. A trait persists because enough people with that trait leave descendants under a given set of conditions. No grandeur is attached to it. No shame is attached to it. Darker skin is not nobler than lighter skin, nor lighter skin than darker. Lactase persistence is not better than lactose intolerance in the abstract. A malaria-protective blood trait is not superior to one shaped by different disease pressures. These are not medals. They are solutions, and many of them are imperfect. Evolution is full of compromises, and compromise is one of the least glamorous truths about being human. By now, the modern world has complicated the story again. Migration is faster than ever. Populations once separated by great distance now live in the same cities, form families together, and create ancestry combinations that would have been geographically unlikely in earlier ages. Medical systems alter the old selective pressures. Food travels across continents. Vitamin deficiencies can be treated. Diseases can be suppressed, though never fully defeated. The ancient environments that shaped many older differences no longer govern every life in the same way. In one sense, this makes the old evolutionary story less predictive. In another, it makes it more visible, because people now carry ancestral adaptations into settings where they sometimes fit poorly, revealing the old logic through friction. And still, beneath modern complexity, the deeper story remains intact. One species leaves Africa and begins changing in new lands. One species stays in Africa and continues changing there in older, broader patterns. The branches twist apart and back together. They acquire visible contrasts, then mix again. They adapt to sun, cold, cattle, parasites, and hunger. They bury their dead under different skies. They carry bits of vanished humans in their DNA. They survive drought, ice, fever, migration, and the inventions that make new pressures out of old ones. No single explanation fully accounts for everything that happened, because the process is too large, too contingent, and too entangled. But the main shape of it is clear enough. Human beings are not fixed, they are historical. That may be the final mystery hidden inside a topic that so often invites certainty. The body looks solid, inherited, obvious, yet it is one of the most changeable things in the story, provided time is long enough. Features that seem eternal are often recent. Boundaries that seem natural are often products of movement and adaptation. Even the continents themselves are poor containers for the full truth, because so much of what matters happens in corridors, margins, refuges, coasts, deserts that become green and then dry again, mountain zones, disease belts, and trade routes. Evolution does not happen to labels. It happens to people living under weather and memory. And perhaps that is where the whole story finally settles. Not in triumph, and not in division, but in recognition. Europeans and Africans evolved differently over time because they lived for long stretches in different worlds. That is the simple answer. The fuller answer is that those worlds were never static, the people were never pure, and the differences were never a hierarchy. They were adjustments, layered into bodies by necessity. They were traces left by sun angle, winter length, water scarcity, herd animals, parasites, and population movement. They were the marks of history on flesh. When the argument is reduced to its barest truth, it sounds almost quiet. Africa is the oldest human home, and Europe is one later branch of the wider dispersal. Africa holds the deepest variation, and Europe records one narrower but distinctive sequence of adaptation and admixture. Both keep changing, both contain internal worlds, both belong to the same species. Everything else, all the ranking and myth and certainty, is something later human beings tried to force on top of that reality. The older reality is enough. It is more than enough. A single species spreads into different climates and does not break. It bends. It adjusts. It carries old solutions into new terrains and sometimes borrows from those already there. It turns food into evolution, weather into anatomy, disease into inheritance. It remains one thing while becoming many local versions of itself. That is not a weakness in the human story. It is the story. As the long ages pass, the differences become visible, then ordinary, then politicized, then studied, then argued over again. But beneath every later interpretation, the same ancient pattern persists. People move, conditions change, bodies answer. The answer is never final. It is only what worked, for a while, under a certain sky. The first fires in Africa, the dim winters of Ice Age Europe, the green Sahara before the dust, the cattle camps, the malarial wetlands, the steppe roads, the village grain stores, the salt tracks across the desert, the crossings of the Mediterranean, the children born from ancestries once far apart, all of them belong to the same unfinished human line. Europeans and Africans are part of that line, not opposite to it. Their differences are real, but their deeper inheritance is shared. In the end, the shared inheritance is the larger fact. The wind down begins in a quieter place than the argument itself. Imagine a shoreline in Africa at dawn, long before any map gives it a name. Imagine people standing there with baskets, tools, children, memory, far to the north, in another age. Imagine a winter valley in Europe where smoke rises low from shelter and the ground holds old footprints beneath fresh frost. These worlds are different. They ask different things of the body. One burns under strong sun. One waits through pale light and cold. One teaches survival through drought, insects, distance, and heat. The other teaches it through winter, scarcity, darkness, and ice-edge seasons. Over time, those lessons settle into skin, blood, digestion, immunity, bone. And still the people in both places remain recognizably the same creature. They fear hunger. They protect their young. They learn the land by repetition. They inherit solutions they do not see being made. They live inside bodies shaped partly by ancestors and partly by conditions that no one chooses. Most of what changes in them happens too slowly to feel. A shade of skin shifts over millennia. A tolerance for milk rises in some valleys and cattle camps. A fragment of ancient immunity survives. A limb grows in proportions suited to weather remembered only by the body itself. The landscapes change too. Green country dries into desert, ice retreats, shorelines move, forests thicken and vanish, villages appear, herds replace hunted game, new people arrive and old people mix with them. The human map never holds still long enough to become what later generations imagine it was. Purity dissolves under time. Certainty dissolves under evidence. What remains is movement, adaptation, survival. Perhaps that is why the story lingers. Not because it proves one people became this and another became that, but because it shows how fragile every fixed identity really is when set against deep time. The body remembers old sunlight, old winters, old diseases, old foods. Yet even those memories are temporary. New migrations begin, new climates come, new mixtures are born. And so the final image is not of division, but of continuity. A species walks out under different skies and keeps changing without losing itself, across Africa, across Europe, across vanished coasts and former grasslands and cold valleys and caravan roads. Human beings remain what they have always been, shaped by the world, carrying the past in silence and moving forward anyway.